Late Tuesday afternoon, a bone-chilling mountain rain began to blanket the sawmill. I was cast out of my own home by my wife and son, like a piece of discarded junk, forced to watch my 3-generation legacy fall into the hands of her lover. The son I raised for 35 years sneered with pure contempt. The era of illiterate carpenters is over, old man. Little did they know, amidst the wreckage of my life, I discovered a hidden code leading to a multi-million-dollar empire my father had secretly built over 3 decades. They think I've been broken, but in truth, the journey to reclaim everything has only just begun. This story begins quietly, but I promise it won't leave you unchanged. Before we start, drop a quick comment for me. What are you doing while you listen? Driving to work, cooking dinner, winding down for the evening, I read everyone. A quick note. Some details are fictionalized for storytelling. The message is what matters most. At 63, I discovered that losing my family's 3-generation lumber mill hurt less than losing the belief that the son I'd raised for 35 years had ever truly been mine. The realization came on a Tuesday in early November when I pulled my truck into the gravel lot behind Copper Creek Valley Lumber Mill. After a 2-day delivery run to Knoxville, the autumn air smelled like cut pine and coming rain. I expected the familiar silence of closing time. The mill shut down at 4, and it was already half past. Instead, I saw my wife standing in front of the storefront with a stranger and a tape measure. Colleen, 58, stood beside the man, with casual confidence wearing the blue jacket I'd bought her last Christmas. The stranger held a clipboard running numbers, while another man, younger, expensive boots, measured the loading dock width with a yellow tape that clicked as it retracted. The younger man was my son. Thane, 35, had quit carpentry at 22, calling it a profession without a future. Now he crouched by the mill's foundation, writing measurements in a leather notebook that probably cost more than my work boots. I parked behind the sycamore tree and watched for 3 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, trying to make sense of geometry that didn't fit. My wife, my son, a stranger with a tape measure, measuring my mill. The stranger smiled and placed his hand on Colleen's shoulder with practiced ease. Not just the affair, I'd realize later, but the entire scheme. I got out. My boots crunched gravel loud enough that all 3 turned. Colleen, I said. What's happening? Bess. She didn't flinch. We sold it, Harlan. The contract was signed yesterday. The words didn't land right. The mill belonged to me, to us. 3 generations. My grandfather built the frame in 1947. My father added the kiln in 1972. I'd run it since he died 12 years ago. You can't sell what isn't yours, I said. The stranger stepped forward, extending his hand. Thornton Wolfe, I've purchased the mill and the property. Your wife's been incredibly helpful with the transition. Thornton Wolfe, 52, a real estate investor from Nashville who'd done this before, not just affairs, but entire schemes. I didn't shake his hand. Thane stood up from the foundation, brushing dirt from his knees. He looked at me, the way you look at a stranger blocking a sidewalk. The era of illiterate carpenters is over, old man, Thane said. Old man, not dad. I reached for my phone thinking of Lloyd Spencer, the lawyer who'd handled my father's estate. My hands shook. You have 30 minutes to get your things, Colleen said, checking her watch. This is no longer your house. The house. Not just the mill. The house where I'd lived for 30 years, where Thane was born, where I'd taught him to plane wood at the kitchen table when he was 8. How long had they been planning this, measuring my life's work while I was on the road, trusting them to keep the lights on, to answer the phone, to tell customers I'd be back Tuesday? How many times had Thornton stood in my office calculating what my family was worth by the square foot? I looked at my son. Thane, this is your grandfather's mill, your heritage. I'm going to sell your mill and build a resort, Thane said, each word deliberate. Copper Creek Valley Resort and Spa. Thornton's already lined up investors. Thornton smiled. Colleen checked her watch again. I walked toward the house phone, still in my hand, trying to dial Lloyd's number. My fingers wouldn't work right. Thane followed me inside, grabbed the phone from my hand, and threw it against the oak floor. The screen shattered into a spiderweb of cracks. Safety glass, the kind that holds together even when it breaks. The same phone I'd used to call my son every Sunday for 35 years. He looked me straight in the eye while he did it. Not impulsive, not angry, just cold. I stood in that living room and realized something I should have seen years ago. In 30 years, not a single photograph on these walls was mine. Not one piece of furniture. The couch belonged to Colleen's mother. The bookshelf came from Thane's apartment. The rocking chair by the fireplace, Colleen bought that at an estate sale. I'd lived here 3 decades and owned nothing but the clothes in my closet and the broken phone on the floor. Get out, Thane said. I bent down, picked up the phone. The screen cut my thumb, a thin line of blood on broken glass. I pressed my thumb to my jeans and walked to the bedroom, pulled my duffel bag from the closet, packed 2 changes of clothes, my father's old watch, and a photograph of my grandfather, standing in front of the mill in 1952. Colleen stood in the doorway watching. There's a motel on Highway 441, she said. You can stay there until you figure things out. Figure things out. Like I was a college kid who'd missed rent. Not a man who'd spent 40 years building a business that his wife had sold to her lover while he was delivering timber to Knoxville. I walked past her, past Thane, who stood in the living room with his arms crossed like a bouncer, past Thornton, who was already measuring the windows. Outside, the November air had turned colder, rain starting to fall. I got in my truck and sat there, hands on the steering wheel, watching through the windshield as Thornton wrote something on his clipboard and Colleen nodded. Thane stood on the porch, arms crossed, making sure I left. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a betrayal born of weakness. This was deliberate erasure. But sitting there in my truck, hands shaking, I remembered something my father once told me about walnut wood and secrets. Something about a workshop I'd only been to once as a boy, hidden in the hills above Copper Ridge, where the old-growth forest still stood. Something about insurance against sons who forget where they came from. I started the engine and drove north away from Copper Creek Valley toward a place I hadn't thought about in 50 years. The old workshop sat 3 miles north of Copper Creek Valley, hidden behind a stand of hickory trees my grandfather had planted in 1949. I hadn't been inside since my father's funeral 12 years ago. That night, standing alone in my father's workshop with a shattered phone in my pocket, I remembered the first lesson he ever taught me: walnut wood never lies. The building smelled like sawdust and motor oil, exactly as it had when I was 10. Rain had started falling harder, tapping against the corrugated iron roof in irregular rhythm. The single oil lamp I'd lit cast shadows across workbenches covered in 50 years of wood shavings and hand tools that nobody had touched since 2012. 30 years of marriage reduced to 30 minutes of packing. Not a single photograph on those walls had belonged to me. Not one piece of furniture. But this desk, this black walnut desk my father built in 1944, this was still his. Still mine. The desk sat against the far wall exactly where he'd left it. 80 years old, darker than coffee grains, so tight you could barely see the growth rings. He'd made it from a single walnut tree that fell during the ice storm of 43 before I was born, before the mill even had a name. I'd been forbidden to touch it my entire childhood. They never opened that middle drawer, he'd told me once when I was maybe 7 reaching for a pencil. Not until you need to. I never asked what that meant. You didn't question my father. I sat in his chair, the same pine rocker he'd used for 40 years, and placed my hands flat on the desktop. The wood was cold, smooth, perfect. And then I was 10 years old again. Summer morning, 1971. The workshop door propped open to let in the breeze. My father, Emmett, 42 years old, then with hands like leather and sawdust, permanently caught in the creases of his knuckles, teaching me to read wood grain by touch alone. "Close your eyes," he'd said, guiding my small fingers across a plank of walnut. "Touch here. Listen to what the wood says." "Wood can't talk," I'd said, because I was 10 and stupid. "Walnut wood never lies," he'd answered. "It tells you everything, how old it is, where it grew, whether it was cut in winter or summer, whether the man who cut it knew what he was doing." He'd moved my fingers to a series of shallow marks carved into the edge of the plank marks I'd thought were accidental scratches. "This is our language," he'd said. "Only we can read it. Your grandfather taught me. I'm teaching you. 1 mark for first grade timber, 2 for export quality, 3 for family work, the pieces we keep, the pieces we build things from, that last forever." I'd trace the marks with my fingertip, feeling the tiny variations in the depth and angle. "Why do we need a secret language?" I'd asked. "Because there are things I will leave to you in my own way," he'd said. "Things that can't be written in a will or explained in a letter. When you are ready, you will be able to read what I leave behind." I'd been learning carpentry, I'd thought at the time. Just carpentry. But sitting at his desk 53 years later, I wondered, when I was 10, had my father actually been teaching me how to survive? The rain grew louder. The lamp flickered. I looked down at the middle drawer, the one I'd never been allowed to touch. For 63 years I'd obeyed that command. Even after he died. Even when I'd come here to clean out the workshop and decided to leave everything exactly as he'd arranged it, I'd never opened that drawer. Tonight I had nothing left to lose. I pulled it open. Inside, resting on a bed of cedar shavings, was a small cherry wood box, no bigger than a deck of cards and a sealed envelope. The box lid was engraved with the old code marks. I traced them with my fingertip, reading the message the way my father had taught me. 3 marks, family work. The pieces we keep, the pieces built to last forever. But it was the envelope that stopped my breath. Cream-colored paper, the expensive kind my father never used for anything. My name written across the front in his tight slanted handwriting, and below my name, a single line. Open when you have nowhere else to stand. My hands started trembling, not from fear, from the impossible sensation that my father was still here, still watching, still waiting for me to understand what he'd been trying to teach me since I was 10 years old. I lifted the envelope closer to the lamp. The handwriting was unmistakably his, the same script I'd seen on 10,000 lumber tags, shipping invoices, birthday cards. The same careful slant, the same way he crossed his T's with a slight downward hook. But the ink looked fresh, not faded, not yellowed, not the brown-gray color that letters turn after a decade in a drawer. This ink was black, sharp, as if it had dried yesterday, as if he'd written this last week. My father had been dead for 12 years. I turned the envelope over. The seal was intact, dark red wax, pressed with the mark of our family's old timber stamp, the one from before the mill was incorporated, before there were lawyers and contracts and official documents. The wax wasn't cracked, wasn't crumbling. It looked poured this morning. Outside, the rain hammered the roof. Inside the lamp, through shadows that looked like a man standing in the corner, watching. I set the envelope back down on the desk and stared at it. Dad, I said aloud to the empty workshop, to the shadows, to the ghost of a man who died when I was 51 and unprepared to lose him. What did you do? The workshop didn't answer. The rain didn't stop. The envelope sat there with its impossible ink and its message I hadn't yet opened. Open when you have nowhere else to stand. I'd been standing somewhere 3 hours ago. I'd had a house, a wife, a son, a business. Now I had a broken phone, a duffel bag, and an envelope that defied physics. I picked it up again, held it under the lamp, examined the handwriting from every angle. The same tight script, the same black ink. Fresh as yesterday. Inside that envelope was either madness or the answer to a question I hadn't known to ask. Either way, I was about to find out. I broke the seal at midnight. The wax cracked cleanly, falling in the dark red chips onto the workshop floor. Inside, 3 pages of cream-colored paper. My father's handwriting covered every inch black ink that looked hours old instead of decades. The first line stopped my breath. Son, if you are reading this, then someone you loved has taken from you what was never theirs to take. I sat down hard in his chair, the oil lamp flickering, rain drumming the roof. I'm not blaming you, my sweet boy. I was just preparing. I saw the signs when you were 20 years old, the way certain people looked at what we had built, the way they measured value in dollars instead of generations. I knew one day someone would try to take the mill. He'd written this 43 years ago, before Colleen, before Thane, before any of this existed. The farmhouse is not what the family thinks, the letter said. I sealed it myself when your mother died. The documents they're looking at are copies. The real deed, the real ownership papers are somewhere else. The key in this envelope will open everything. I looked at the drawer. No key, just the cherry box. The box is the key, the letter continued. Use the code I taught you, the one only we know. The marks will tell you where to go and what to do when you get there. I picked up the cherry box and turned it under the lamplight. The lid was covered in carved marks, the old timber code. I traced them with my fingertip reading. 3 deep marks, family work. 2 shallow marks angled left, second location. 1 mark shaped like a tree, forest. Below that, numbers carved so small I had to squint, GPS coordinates. The letter's final page gave instructions. There's another workshop, our real workshop, that I've never told anyone about, not even your mother. I've been building there since 1987, building something much greater than shelter, building insurance against exactly what's happening to you right now. My throat went tight. Go to Copper Ridge, find the ranger, say my name, he'll know what to do. The code on the box will show you where to go after that. Don't trust lawyers, don't trust courts, trust wood, Trust what I built. It was signed simply, Dad. I read the letter 3 times, then a 4th. How had my father known 30 years before it happened that this exact betrayal would come? How had he seen Colleen in my future, seen Thane's coldness, seen the guardianship petition I didn't even know existed yet? He couldn't have. It was impossible. But the letter sat in my hands and the ink was black, and my father's voice came through every word as clearly as if he were standing beside me. I sat there until dawn, watching gray light creep through the windows, listening to the rain slow and finally stop. The workshop smelled like old sawdust and wet earth. He knew everything before I knew. At 8 in the morning, exhausted and hollow, I walked back to the millhouse kitchen, maybe for coffee, maybe to see if they were still there, maybe because I was too tired to think straight. Colleen and Thane sat at the table waiting. Good, Colleen said. You're here. We need you to sign something. She slid a stack of documents across the table. Legal paper, official stamps, not divorce papers, this was something else. Guardianship petition. Thane said casual as ordering breakfast. The court will appoint a guardian to manage your affairs. For your own protection. I picked up the first page and read. Petitioner alleges cognitive decline, poor financial management failure to attend medical appointments, inability to manage day-to-day affairs without supervision. My family doctor's name appeared 3 times, Dr. Aaron Brenner. Medical notes attached. Dates I'd supposedly missed appointments. Evidence I'd supposedly shown confusion. Memory loss, impaired judgment. I'd never missed an appointment in my life. But there it was signed and dated. First hearing, November 29th. A voice said from Colleen's laptop on the table. A lawyer's face filled the screen. 3 weeks from today, the court will review the medical evidence and testimony from family members. I looked at Thane. He looked back expressionless. You're trying to have me declared incompetent, I said. Colleen folded her hands. The court will appoint a guardian, for your own protection. And who would that guardian be? I asked, though I already knew. Me, Thane said. I'm family. I can make decisions in your best interest. They didn't just want the mill. They wanted to erase me from the legal map. Take my name off every document, every deed, every bank account. Put Thane's name there instead. Make me a ward of the state-controlled and powerless. 21 days. They had calculated exactly how long before I would no longer exist. I set the papers down carefully and stood. I'm not signing this, I said. The lawyer on the screen smiled. You don't have to. The petition has already been filed. The hearing is scheduled. You can attend with your own attorney if you choose. Colleen pushed her chair back. Aaron Brenner's testimony will be very persuasive. He's been your doctor for 15 years. He's never said I'm incompetent, I said. He will, Thane said. On the stand, under oath. I looked at my son, at the man I'd raised for 35 years, at the stranger who'd thrown my phone on the floor and was now trying to erase me from existence in 3 weeks. You really think you've won? I said. Thane smiled. I know I have. I walked out of that kitchen, out of that house, got in my truck with my father's letter and the cherry box on the passenger seat. 21 days. They had given me 21 days before a judge would decide whether I was still competent to control my own life. 21 days before my son could become my legal guardian and I would disappear into whatever nursing home he chose. But they had made one miscalculation. They thought I had nowhere left to run. I had my father's letter, a wooden box carved in code, and the name of a ranger in a place called Copper Ridge. Back in my truck, I opened the cherrywood box. No iron key inside, no combination lock, no folded deed or hidden document. Just a 10-centimeter walnut stick hand-carved, covered with marks I hadn't tried to read in 40 years. I held it up to the afternoon light slanting through the windshield. The wood was old-growth walnut, dark as coffee grains, so tight you could barely see the annual rings. My father had carved symbols along all 4 sides. Shallow cuts, no deeper than a millimeter, precise as typography. The old timber code, the language he'd taught me at age 10. The language only we shared, not a key, a test. Father wanted to know if I still remembered. I drove back to the workshop, hands shaking on the steering wheel, parked, carried the stick inside, and set it on his workbench under the oil lamp I'd left burning since midnight. Retrieved his magnifying lens from the tool drawer, the one with the brass handle he'd used for examining grain patterns, found a notebook with clean pages, sharpened a pencil with my pocket knife. Then I started translating. The first mark was simple 3 parallel lines. North. I remembered that one immediately. The second took longer, a curved line with 2 dots. Water source, stream, or spring. The third mark stopped me cold. A symbol I'd only seen a handful of times, 2 vertical lines joined at the top, spreading at the bottom. Ancient growth. Old forest timber trees over 100 years. I wrote it all down, working mark by mark, turning the stick in my hands. Some symbols came back instantly, muscle memory stronger than conscious thought. Others required minutes of staring, waiting for the meaning to surface from decades-old lessons. A triangle meant elevation. A single dot meant measurement. Crossed lines meant intersection or choice. My coffee went cold in its cup. The light through the window's shifted angle. My hands cramped from gripping the pencil. 2 hours passed. This mark means north, I said aloud to the empty workshop, testing my translation. This one, ancient growth. And this, 40. 40 what? I turned the stick again. On the opposite side, another number 13. Then a symbol for measurement. Distance, not depth. My father had encoded this knowing I might forget, but also knowing desperation would force me to remember. Why had he chosen this method? Not a locked box, not a hidden map, but a language that would die if I didn't use it. A language that required me to prove I was still his son, still connected to the lessons he had taught, still worthy of what he'd prepared. I set down the magnifying lens and rubbed my eyes. The workshop smelled like sawdust and old motor oil. Rain had started again, soft tapping on the corrugated roof. Then I saw it. The pattern wasn't random. The marks weren't just instructions. They were coordinates. I grabbed the pencil again, writing fast. The numbers weren't tree measurements. They were GPS positions. Latitude and longitude hidden in quality grades and timber classifications. 36 degrees, 13 minutes north. 83 degrees, 47 minutes west. I pulled out my broken phone. Screen still shattered from where Thane had thrown it, but the GPS app still worked if I was careful not to touch the cracks. Entered the coordinates. Copper Ridge, Tennessee, exactly where the letter had said. The map showed dense forests, no roads within 2 miles, elevation markers indicating steep terrain. National forest land. Protected wilderness. I went back to the stick, translating the remaining marks with new understanding. A symbol I'd forgotten, 2 lines rising from a single point, spreading like branches. Double trunk. A tree with 2 trunks growing from one root system. Double trunk walnut, I whispered. Find the double trunk walnut tree. The next marks gave instructions fast north, count 40 paces. The number 40 appeared twice, once as measurement, once as direction. And the final 3 marks carved smallest of all, along the bottom edge, a rectangle with a peaked roof. A circle. 3 parallel vertical lines. Workshop. Truth. Wait, if Father hid the workshop the way he hid everything, I said to the empty room, in plain sight to anyone who couldn't read the language. I sat back from the workbench, the decoded message written in my notebook. GPS, 36 degrees, 13 minutes north, 83 degrees, 47 minutes west. Copper Ridge National Forest. Find double trunk walnut ancient growth. Face north. Count 40 paces. Location workshop. My hands moved across the marks the way they'd moved across wood grain as a boy. Memory lived in the fingers, not the mind. The walnut stick was warm from being held smooth, where my father's knife had carved away everything that wasn't message. I'd done it. Decoded his language after 4 decades of silence. Found the coordinates. Understood the instructions. But doubt crept in like cold air under a door. I hadn't used this code since I was 23 years old. The year I quit carpentry and took a job at the lumber mill's business office. The year I told my father I wanted to work with contracts instead of wood numbers, instead of grain patterns. The year I'd seen something die in his eyes, though, he'd never said a word of complaint. What if desperation had made me see patterns that weren't really there? What if I'd translated wrong, confused north with depth, mistaken coordinates for tree measurements seen meaning in random scratches? What if the workshop at those coordinates was nothing but abandoned forest, and I'd spent 2 hours decoding my own desperate hope instead of my father's actual message? I picked up the walnut stick again, turned it under the lamp, examined every mark. They looked right, felt right. The pattern made sense. But I'd been wrong before. Wrong about Colleen, wrong about Thane, wrong about who I could trust and what I actually owned. I set the stick down carefully beside my notebook. Coordinates decoded, instructions clear, location identified. But there was only one way to know if I'd read it correctly. I had to call the one person my father said would be waiting. The ranger? Whoever that was. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. So I called the one man who'd known my father almost as long as I had Chester Bennett, wood appraiser, and my closest friend for 40 years. Chester was 65, with white hair and hands permanently stained from wood oils. He'd cried openly at my father's funeral in 2012, standing in the rain with his hat pressed against his chest. We'd worked together on appraisal shared coffee every Sunday morning for decades, traded stories about timber and grain patterns and the way old walnut smells when you plane it fresh. If anyone could tell me whether I decoded the marks correctly, it was Chester. I sat in my truck in the mill parking lot Wednesday evening, phone in my hand, watching the sun set behind bare November trees. Rain had stopped, sky turning purple and gray. Dialed his number at 6 o'clock. 2 rings. His hello. Chester, it's me. Silence. 5 full seconds of silence. Then, I've been waiting for this call. The words came out flat. Not surprised. Not confused. Like he'd been sitting by the phone expecting it. Chester, what are you talking about? I need to ask you about Copper Ridge, he said. I know. Don't say anything else. Come to my workshop in Knoxville tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. sharp. How did you... Not on the phone, Chester said. His voice had an edge I'd never heard before. Fear, maybe, or something close to it. Just come, tomorrow morning, we'll talk then. He hung up. I sat there staring at the phone, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Chester knew about Copper Ridge before I'd mentioned it. He'd been waiting for my call. Waiting for what? Days, weeks, years. The decoded message suddenly felt more real. If Chester knew if he'd been waiting, then my translation was right. The coordinates were real. The workshop existed. But how had Chester known I would call? How had he known about Copper Ridge at all? I didn't sleep that night. Left the mill at 5 in the morning. Thursday drove the hour to Knoxville in pre-dawn darkness. My truck's headlights cut through fog rolling off the mountains. Rain had started again, soft patter on the windshield. My mind wouldn't stop racing. Chester's voice on the phone, I've been waiting for this call, played over and over. The way he'd cut me off, the way he'd known exactly what I was going to ask about. How had my father known 15 years ago that I would one day need to find Copper Ridge, that I would lose everything and need somewhere to run? I reached Knoxville at 6:45, drove through empty streets to the warehouse district south of downtown, where Chester ran his appraisal business out of a 2-story brick building that used to be a furniture factory. The sign above the door read, Bennett and Associates, Fine Wood Appraisal. I pulled into the gravel lot at exactly 7 o'clock. Chester was waiting at the door. He looked like he hadn't slept either. Red eyes, gray stubble, coffee cup in his hand, steam rising in the cold morning air. Come in, he said. Not good morning, not how are you holding up. Just come in. I followed him through the warehouse floor. Rows of antique furniture waiting for evaluation shelves of wood samples, the smell of old timber and varnish. And up a narrow staircase to his cluttered office. Books everywhere, antique catalogs, photographs of furniture, a desk buried under papers, the scent of black coffee and wood dust. Chester closed the door behind us. Then he went to a small safe in the corner, knelt down, worked the combination. The safe door swung open. He reached inside and pulled out a yellowed envelope. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting. Your father sent this to me 15 years ago, Chester said, still kneeling by the safe, holding the envelope like it might burn him. He made me promise to only give it to you when you came asking about Copper Ridge. My throat went dry. 15 years, I said. That was 2009. I was 50. Dad was still alive. I know, Chester said. He stood up, walked to his desk, set the envelope down. He came to my workshop one morning, handed me this, made me swear I wouldn't open it, wouldn't tell you about it, wouldn't even mention it until you came to me asking about Copper Ridge specifically. I picked up the envelope. The paper was old edges brown with age, my father's handwriting, the same tight script from the letter I'd read at midnight. He knew Harlan, Chester said quietly. Somehow he knew this exact day would come. I opened the envelope with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Inside a single sheet of paper, 3 lines written in my father's hand. Lloyd Spencer, 8655550147. Tell him your father sent this. He will lead you into the forest. I held the envelope Chester had kept for 15 years and realized my father had been protecting me from a distance I couldn't measure, across time itself. Planning for a moment he'd never live to see, preparing for a betrayal that wouldn't happen for another decade and a half. Did he tell you why? I asked. Chester shook his head. Just said that one day you'd need it. That one day everything would fall apart and you'd come looking for answers. He said when that day came, I should give you this and tell you. He paused, voice breaking. Tell you that he was sorry he couldn't be there himself. I looked down at the paper. Lloyd Spencer's name, a phone number, instructions written in 2009. My father had sent this envelope to Chester 3 years before he died. 15 years before Colleen and Thane would betray me. 15 years before, I would decode a wooden stick and need to find Copper Ridge. He had known. Somehow, impossibly, he had known this exact moment would come. The question that kept me awake that night wasn't what my father had hidden at Copper Ridge. It was how much of my life he'd seen coming. Lloyd Spencer's phone number was written in my father's hand, and I had exactly 20 days left before the guardianship hearing. I called Lloyd Spencer from Chester's parking lot. He answered on the first ring as if he'd been holding the phone. Emmett Ingram's son, I said, following my father's instructions from the 15-year-old letter. I've been waiting, Lloyd said. Ridge Trail, Copper Ridge coordinates. Come at sunset. I'll be at the tree. Then he hung up. The higher I drove into the Smoky Mountains, following coordinates decoded from my father's wooden key, the more I understood that I was not discovering my father's secret. I was stepping into a world he'd built without ever telling me it existed. Ridge Trail was barely a road, dirt and gravel narrowing as the elevation increased, winding through dense forest that pressed close on both sides. My truck climbed steadily, engine grinding in low gear, afternoon light filtering through branches overhead. Then the forest changed. Walnut trees, hundreds of them, thousands. But these weren't wild growth. I slowed the truck, staring. Each trunk measured nearly arm's length in diameter, 60 years minimum, maybe 80. The bark was dark and deeply furrowed, the canopy thick overhead. And they were planted in rows, not perfectly straight like an orchard, but deliberate, spaced for optimal growth, tended. These trees aren't wilderness, I thought. Everyone was planted, tended, protected. I pulled over, got out, walked to the nearest tree, placed my palm against the bark, cold, rough, real. Walnut this size was worth a fortune. A single tree could yield thousands in lumber, premium grade, export quality. The kind of wood my father had taught me to recognize by grain pattern alone, and the forest stretched as far as I could see in every direction. My father's voice came back to me from childhood, standing in the mill yard, teaching me to grade timber. The best walnut wood never goes to market. It waits for the right person. I'd thought he was talking about patience, about waiting for the right buyer. He'd been talking about this, about a forest he was growing for a future he wouldn't live to see. I got back in the truck and kept driving, counting trees as I went. Rows and rows of them, perfectly spaced, perfectly tended. No undergrowth choking their roots. No dead wood left to rot. This was intentional cultivation, spanning decades. 800 acres of forest, and my father had never told a soul. I had walked through parts of this forest as a boy, never knowing my father owned every tree, every acre, never knowing he'd planted a future I couldn't see. The GPS coordinates led me deeper, higher, until the trail opened into a small clearing. And there it was, the double-trunked walnut tree. 2 massive trunks growing from a single root system, intertwined like clasped hands, rising 50 feet into the golden sunset light. The exact landmark from my father's wooden code. I parked the truck and stepped out. A man stood at the base of the tree. He was already there, waiting. No sound of approach, no vehicle I could see. Just standing motionless in the clearing, like part of the landscape. Lloyd Spencer I knew without asking. 61, maybe 62. Tall and lean, wearing canvas work pants and a flannel jacket. Gray beard trimmed close, hands in his pockets. Eyes that tracked my movement with the stillness of someone who'd spent years in forests. I walked toward him. Dead leaves crunched under my boots. The air smelled like walnut bark and coming rain. He extended his hand when I was 10 feet away. I shook it. We stood there in complete silence for 10 full seconds, his hand gripping mine, eye contact unwavering. Not aggressive, not threatening, just acknowledging. Like we were completing a transaction that had started before either of us was born. Finally he spoke. "Your father saved my life in 1987, Lloyd said. His voice was quiet, measured, Tennessee accent softened by years. I owe him a life. I didn't know what to say to that. I've repaid him with 20 years guarding this forest, Lloyd continued. He released my hand, reached into his jacket pocket. And I've repaid him with 18 months gathering evidence of what your wife and son are doing. He pulled out a small USB drive, black plastic, no bigger than my thumb, handed it to me. I took it, the metal cool against my palm. 18 months, I said. Lloyd nodded. Started watching when your wife began meeting with real estate investors. Followed the paper trail. Documented every conversation, every contract discussion, every meeting with lawyers. Your father told me years ago that if anything ever happened to you, I should protect what he built. 18 months. Lloyd had been gathering evidence for 18 months before Colleen served those guardianship papers. He had known what was coming, while I still believed I had a family. You knew, I said, before I knew. I suspected, Lloyd corrected. Your father taught me to watch for patterns, to see what people do when they think nobody's looking. Your wife started measuring the mill 18 months ago. Your son started meeting with investors 16 months ago. I documented everything. 18 months, while I trusted my wife, trusted my son, Lloyd had been watching them measure my life for auction. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. Because your father's instructions were clear, Lloyd said. Don't intervene, don't warn. Just gather evidence and wait for you to find your way here. He said you'd need proof, not warnings. He said warnings would make you doubt yourself. Proof would make you fight. And I looked down at the USB drive in my hand. What's on this? Everything, Lloyd said. Financial records, meeting transcripts, photos of your wife with Thornton Wolfe, audio recordings of your son planning to sell the mill before the divorce was even filed, email exchanges about the guardianship petition, 18 months of documentation that proves fraud, conspiracy, and intent. The USB drive felt heavier than it should have, weighted with all the moments I'd missed, all the signs I'd ignored, all the times I'd walked past them, planning my erasure while I thought we were still family. Thank you, I said. Lloyd shook his head. Don't thank me. Your father saved my life. This is payment on a debt I'll never finish repaying. He turned, looked back toward the trail leading deeper into the forest. But the evidence is only the beginning, Lloyd said. Your father didn't just hide files in forest. He built something down in the valley below. Something he wanted you to have when you had nowhere else to stand. He started walking. I followed. Lloyd said nothing after handing me the USB drive, just turned and walked down a narrow trail I hadn't noticed moving through the walnut forest, like a man who'd walked this path 1,000 times in darkness. I followed. The trail was steep, barely visible in the fading light. Tree roots crossed the path like tripwires. Lloyd moved with the confidence of absolute familiarity, never pausing to check his footing, never looking back to see if I was keeping pace. We descended for 15 minutes in silence. The walnut trees pressed close on both sides, their canopy blocking what little twilight remained. The air grew cooler as we moved deeper into the valley. I could hear water somewhere below, a stream or spring running over rocks. The valley itself was invisible from the ridge above, perfect natural concealment. You couldn't see it from any angle unless you were already inside it. My father had chosen this location for absolute privacy. You can't stumble on this place, I thought. You have to know it's here. Lloyd finally broke the silence. Your father built this in 1991, he said, not turning around, still walking. 33 years of secrets. 1991. I'd been 30 years old, working at the mill, married to Colleen for 5 years. Thane was 2 years old. I'd thought I knew my father's life, knew his routines, his business, his plans. He'd been building a hidden workshop in the mountains, and I'd never noticed. The trail leveled out. The trees opened into a small clearing, and there it was, a compact building made of Appalachian granite, the stone dark gray and solid, black steel roof barely visible in the dusk, thick oak door with iron hinges. Above the door, a hand-painted sign, faded but still legible. Copper Ridge Workshop, EC. EC, my father's initials. All the windows were boarded from the inside, heavy planks secured with iron nails. The structure stood straight and solid despite 3 decades of weather. My father had built this to last. How long has this been here? I asked, though Lloyd had just told me. Since 1991, Lloyd repeated. He walked to the door, placed his palm against the oak. I've been watching over it for 20 years. Your father trusted me with everything. How does a man build a granite workshop and secret stock it, with decades of timber, and never tell his own son it exists? Lloyd traced his fingers along the doorframe. I saw marks carved into the oak, shallow cuts deliberately placed. The same woodworking code my father had taught me. The same language I'd decoded from the walnut stick. Lloyd's fingers moved over the marks in a specific pattern, like reading Braille. Then he pushed the door. It swung open on hinges that didn't make a sound, well-oiled, recently maintained. The interior was dark. Lloyd reached inside, found a switch, and electric lights flickered on overhead. I stepped through the doorway and stopped breathing. The workshop was perfect. A massive black walnut workbench dominated the center, 6 meters long, solid as a monument. Tools hung on pegboard walls in organized rows, hand planes, chisels, saws, mallets all clean and oiled. Dozens of walnut planks were stacked against the far wall, each labeled in my father's handwriting, with wood-type harvest year tree location. Every tool hung in perfect alignment, every plank labeled in father's meticulous script. This wasn't a hideaway. It was a cathedral to craft. A stone held down a single sheet of paper on the workbench. I walked over, picked it up. My father's handwriting, practical instructions written in his characteristic shorthand. Fireplace works, water pump behind building, bedroom through door on left, food and cabinet check dates, tools maintained monthly, timber warehouse 200 meters north, follow stream. And at the bottom, one final line. My diary is in the box under this workbench. I set the note down, ran my fingers along the nearest walnut plank. The wood was smooth, cool, and slick with oil. Fresh oil. I lifted my hand to my nose. Linseed oil. The smell was unmistakable. Sharp, organic, recent. Lloyd, I said slowly. When did you last maintain these planks? He stood in the doorway, backlit by the last traces of twilight. Every month, he said. Just like your father taught me. The wood has to be protected. Can't let it dry out or the grain cracks. My father's been dead for 12 years. I know. But this oil, it's fresh, almost wet. I was here 3 days ago, Lloyd said quietly. I oil the planks on the 1st of every month. Have been since your father died. He made me promise to keep everything ready. I looked around the workshop again with new understanding. The tools weren't just clean. They were sharp oiled, ready to use. The floor wasn't dusty. It was swept. The air didn't smell stale. It smelled like fresh wood and linseed oil. Lloyd hadn't just been watching over this place. He'd been living it, maintaining it, keeping it alive the way my father would have. And ready for what? I asked. For you, Lloyd said. He said one day you'd need it. Need somewhere to stand when everything else fell apart. He made me promise to keep it ready so you wouldn't have to wait. I touched the walnut plank again, and my fingertips came away slick with oil, fresh enough that I could smell the linseed. My father had labeled this plank in 1998, 26 years ago. He had died in 2012, 12 years ago. Someone had been here recently caring for this wood the way my father would have. Someone was keeping this workshop alive. I looked at Lloyd standing silent in the doorway, and suddenly I needed to know exactly how much he'd been doing in these woods for 20 years. What else? I asked. Lloyd met my eyes. Your father left you more than a workshop, he said. There's a warehouse full of timber, 30 years of the finest walnut and cherry in East Tennessee. Every piece he cut, dried, and stored, waiting for you. He turned toward the darkness outside. I'll show you tomorrow, he said. Tonight you should sleep. The bedroom's ready. I put fresh sheets on the bed this morning. That first night in my father's secret workshop, I followed his handwritten instructions exactly. Lit the fireplace with kindling stacked in a neat pile beside the hearth. The draw was perfect. My father had built the chimney with the precision of a man who understood airflow and stone. Flames caught immediately, warming the granite walls. Found the bedroom upstairs through the door on the left, just as the note had said. Small room with a single window boarded from outside. An oil lamp hung on a hook by the door. I lit it. Against the far wall stood a cedar chest. I opened it, and the smell of lavender rose up. Sachets my father must have placed there decades ago. Inside crisp white linens folded with hospital corners. Sheets that had never been slept on, sealed in cedar waiting. I made the bed by lamplight, spreading the sheets across a mattress that smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Then I looked up. The ceiling was black walnut. Every plank hand-sanded and oiled. Not rough lumber thrown overhead for weather protection, but finished wood. Crafted. My father had treated this ceiling the way other men treat furniture, like something that mattered, like something that deserved care. Even here, I thought, even the ceiling that nobody would see, he made it beautiful. I lay down on top of the covers, fully clothed, meaning to rest my eyes for a few minutes. I slept 11 hours. No dreams, no waking in the night, reaching for a phone that wasn't there. Just sleep. Deep and complete, with wind rustling through the walnut forest outside and the fire crackling downstairs. I woke in my father's workshop, and for the first time in 40 years, understood what it meant to feel safe. Not protected by locks or walls, but by love that had waited decades to be found. Morning light came through gaps in the boarded window, a single shaft of gold falling across the white quilt. I could hear birds outside, the sound of a stream somewhere close. I sat up slowly, disoriented. Friday morning, 7 o'clock maybe, the fire downstairs had burned to embers. I'd slept better than any night in 20 years. The forest didn't need me to do anything, just to be here. Footsteps on the stairs. Lloyd appeared in the doorway, holding a tin cup of black coffee. He didn't say anything, just nodded and set the cup on the small table beside the bed. Then he went back downstairs and returned with bread and butter on a wooden plate. "You slept 11 hours, Lloyd said quietly. "Your father would be glad." I took the coffee. It was strong and hot and exactly what I needed. "How long have you been awake?" I asked. "I don't sleep much," Lloyd said. "Never have." He stood there while I ate, the first real food I'd had in 2 days. Fresh bread, salted butter. Simple, perfect. When I finished, Lloyd nodded toward the stairs. "Come," he said. "I'll show you the warehouse." We walked out of the workshop into cold November morning air. Frost on the ground, my breath visible. The walnut trees stood silent all around us, their bare branches sharp against a gray sky. Lloyd led me to a larger building I hadn't noticed in the dark, set back from the workshop built into the hillside. Natural stone foundation, heavy timber frame, roof with deliberate gaps for ventilation and light. He opened the door. Inside the building stretched 30 meters deep, maybe 15 wide, and every inch of floor space was filled with lumber. Hundreds of planks, maybe thousands. Arranged in neat rows from floor to ceiling, organized by type and size. Black walnut, cherry, some oak, all milled, dried, and stored with the care of museum pieces. Each plank had a label tied to one end with wire. I walked to the nearest stack and read the tag. Black walnut, August 1993, North Ridge section, 4, 847 pounds, 12% moisture. 1993, 31 years ago. I'd been 32 years old. Thane was 4. I moved to the next plank, 1995, then 1997, 1999, 2001. Every plank labeled in my father's handwriting. Wood type, harvest date, specific tree location in the forest, weight, moisture content measured and recorded. He only took what the forest offered naturally, Lloyd said from the doorway. 1 tree a year, sometimes 2. Never more than it could give. Trees that fell in storms, trees that needed thinning for the health of the forest. He never cut a healthy tree just for lumber. Each labeled plank was a year of my father's silent work, 30 years of waiting compressed into rows of wood that would outlive us both. I walked deeper into the warehouse, reading tags as I went. 2003, 2005, 2008, 2010. The last tag I found was dated 2011, 1 year before my father died. A massive black walnut plank, nearly 3 meters long, perfectly quarter-sawn, to show the tight medullary rays my father had taught me to value. Black walnut. September 2011, double trunk tree north, clearing 1,240 pounds. The double trunk tree where Lloyd had been waiting for me. My father had harvested 1 trunk in 2011, left the other standing as a landmark, as a sign. "How much is all this worth?" I asked. Lloyd was quiet for a moment. Current market value for premium walnut, maybe $4.5 million, maybe more. Your father never wanted to sell it. He wanted to leave it. $4.5 million in lumber, stacked in a warehouse nobody knew existed, maintained for 12 years by a man who owed my father a life debt. I stood in the middle of that warehouse surrounded by 30 years of my father's patient work, thinking I had finally seen the full scope of what he'd built. Lloyd watched me from the doorway. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but certain. "This isn't even the most important part," he said. "I haven't shown you what's really down there yet." I turned to look at him. Down where? Lloyd gestured back toward the workshop. "Beneath," he said. "Your father built a vault under the workshop floor. Stone room, climate controlled. That's where he kept what really mattered. A stone vault beneath the workshop. My father had saved his greatest secrets for the bottom. Lloyd led me back to the workshop and pointed to a trap door in the floor near the workbench. "And down there," he said. "I'll be outside if you need me." Then he left, closing the door behind him with a soft click. I stood alone in my father's workshop, looking at the trap door I hadn't noticed before, hidden under a rug, invisible unless you knew where to look. But I didn't open it. Not yet. Because my father's note had said something else first. My diary is in the box under this workbench. I knelt beside the massive black walnut workbench and reached underneath fingers, searching the darkness. Found wood, a box, pulled it out into the light. Black walnut hand-fitted joints, no nails. The kind of box my father made when something mattered. The lid fit so precisely I could barely see the seam. I found my father's diary exactly where his note said it would be, in this wooden box beneath the workbench. And holding it felt like holding something I had no right to touch, like reading letters written to a different son. The diary itself had a cover of walnut wood, hand-bound with leather cord, threaded through holes my father had drilled himself. 200 pages, maybe more, thick with years. My father had bound this diary himself. Even his most private thoughts got the carpenter's touch. I opened to the first page. The date read January 15th, 1989. 35 years ago. I'd been 28 years old, married, working at the mill. My father's handwriting filled the page. The same tight script I'd seen on lumber tags and letters, but looser here, more human. The first entry began. "My son will not read this until he needs to. I hope that day never comes. But if it does, then I am prepared." I stopped breathing. 200 pages. How much pain does a man need to write 200 pages? I read on. "I am 60 years old. I have spent 40 years building furniture, milling lumber, teaching my son the trade I learned from my father. Today my wife told me I should sell the mill and do something respectable. She said I smell like sawdust at family dinners. She said carpentry is old-fashioned. She said I embarrass her in front of her friends." I turned the page. I told her I would think about it. I will not think about it. I will keep working, because walnut takes 80 years to become good wood. No one is willing to wait anymore, but I can wait. I have always been able to wait. How does a man endure 40 years of being dismissed by the people he loves most, and never once let the bitterness show? I read forward entries spanning weeks, then months. February 1989. "She told the neighbors I'm a simple craftsman, not an insult, she said, just the truth." March 1989. "My son asked if I would consider retiring early. He means well. He wants me to rest. He doesn't understand that this work is the rest." May 1989. "I am building something they will never see. A place where the work matters more than the approval. A place where I can be exactly what I am." I stopped reading and looked around the workshop. The perfectly aligned tools, the hand-sanded ceiling, the workbench that had taken months to build. This was that place. I turned to 1990. More entries. Small humiliations recorded in careful detail. July 1990. "My wife complained that I smell like sawdust at family dinners. I showered twice and changed clothes. She still complained. I have stopped attending family dinners." November 1990. "My son brought his college friends to the mill. I heard one of them ask what I do for a living. My son said he runs the family lumber business. Not, he's a carpenter. Not, he builds furniture. Just runs the business. Like I'm a manager. Like the craft is something to hide." I turned to 1991, and there it was. March 1991, the entry that stopped my heart. "My son quit the trade today. He is 22 years old. He told me carpentry has no future. He said he wants to go into finance work with numbers instead of wood. He said wood is for people who don't have better options. I told him I understood. I lied. My heart broke." I was 22 in 1991. He was writing about me. I had told my father his profession had no future, and he had smiled and said he understood, then built a workshop in secret and never mentioned my betrayal again. "I will not blame him," the entry continued. "He is young, he sees what the world values and wants to be valued, but I know something he doesn't know. Yet the world changes what it values every 10 years. Craft lasts forever. I will wait. When he needs what lasts, I will have prepared it." The next entry was dated June 1991. "I have purchased 800 acres of forest land in Copper Ridge. Nobody knows. I will build a workshop there. A real workshop. Not for business, not for family approval, for the work itself. and for my son in case he ever needs somewhere to stand when everything else falls apart. June 1991. The same year I'd told him carpentry had no future. The same year he'd started building this sanctuary. I sat on the workshop floor holding the diary, and the weight of 40 years settled on my chest like stone. I had scorned my father, and he had never said a word. He had just kept sawing wood, kept teaching me the code I'd forget, kept preparing for the day I would need him. My father had kept 40 years of pain in this diary. Every dismissal, every humiliation, every moment his family treated carpentry like a shameful thing, and he had never spoken a word of it aloud. The day I had scorned him was the day he began building my sanctuary. I closed the diary and pressed it against my chest alone in the workshop he had built in silence, understanding that I had been part of the family that broke his heart, and he had loved me anyway, prepared for me anyway, waited for me anyway. But the diary was only beginning. 1991 was when my father's real preparation started. I had 200 pages left to read. I couldn't stop reading. I turned past the painful early years to 1994, the year I married Colleen, and found the page where my father's grief transformed into something else, a plan executed with the precision of a master carpenter, building something meant to last generations. The diary entry was dated April 1994, 3 months before my wedding. Met my son's fiancée today, Colleen, 33 years old, works in real estate development, beautiful, confident. During dinner, she asked about the mill, not what we make there, but how much the property is worth. I told her. She asked if we'd ever considered selling. I said no. She smiled and said, "Never say never." The next paragraph made my hands shake. She asked about the mill's property value before asking what I make there. I know what that means. I have seen this pattern before. She is not a bad woman. She is ambitious. My son is not ambitious. This will end badly. Maybe not for 20 years, maybe 30, but it will end. 30 years ago, my father had seen exactly what would happen, and never said a word to me. I turned to the entry dated 3 months after my wedding. October 1994. They seem happy. She smiles at him. He smiles at her. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe she will learn to love the craft. Maybe my son will learn to be ambitious. Maybe. But I cannot bet his future on maybe. I am making preparations. How does a father know 30 years in advance the exact shape his son's heartbreak will take and prepare for it without once saying, "I told you so"? The next entry was a list, just dates and actions written in my father's systematic shorthand. July 1994, established Copper Ridge Family Trust, First Heritage Bank, co-trustee, irrevocable, Harlan sole beneficiary, 800 acres forest land, all improvements, all structures, cannot be touched by divorce, bankruptcy, or creditor claims. July 1994, 2 months after my wedding. While I was on my honeymoon, my father was building a legal fortress I didn't know existed. August 1994. Met with Lloyd Spencer. Formalized 20-year guardianship agreement for the property. Possibly more. He understands the mission. He understands loyalty. He owes me. He will not fail. Lloyd. Even then my father had been recruiting allies. September 1994. Began acquiring Appalachian antique collection through Chester Bennett. Focus 18th and 19th century craftsmanship. Museum quality. Investment value secondary to cultural preservation. Chester will maintain confidentiality. Chester. Another soldier in my father's quiet army. December 1994. Completed stone vault beneath workshop. Climate controlled, secure, ready for collection storage and document preservation. I set the diary down and looked around the workshop. My father had done all of this, trust guardianship vault collection, while attending my wedding, Christmas dinners, Sunday lunches, smiling, shaking Colleen's hand, acting like everything was normal. He had been building my future while I was living my present. I turned to the next entry dated December 30th, 1994. Different handwriting, shakier, like he'd written it late at night, maybe with whiskey. I am not doing this because I hate my daughter-in-law. I do not hate her. I am not doing this because I want my son to fail. I want him to succeed. I am doing this because I know my son is soft-hearted. He loves deeply. He trusts completely. He believes the best of people even when the evidence suggests otherwise. These are beautiful qualities, but soft-hearted people need a stronger foundation than others. They need something that cannot be taken away when the people they trust turn against them. My throat closed. I am building that foundation, not out of fear, out of love. My son will think I am building for myself, for my own satisfaction, for my own legacy. Let him think that. When the day comes that he needs this place, he will understand. And maybe, I hope, he will forgive me for seeing what he could not see. There was one more entry for 1994, December 31st, New Year's Eve. Different pen, darker ink. Like he'd saved this thought, written it separately, kept it for its significance. I read it 3 times before I understood what it meant. Starting tomorrow, every piece of walnut wood I saw, every plank I flatten, every tree I select from the forest. I do it for my son, not for the market, not for money, not for reputation, for him. When he has nowhere else to stand, he will have 800 acres of forest and a workshop full of wood that waited for him. Every cut I make from now on is love I cannot speak aloud. I had walked past my father in that mill 1,000 times, watched him saw wood, and never once understood that every cut was a sentence in a love letter I wouldn't read for decades. Every piece of wood my father sawed after December 31st, 1994, 18 years of work from the day I married Colleen until the day he died in 2012. He did it for me. Not for business, not for craft, not for the satisfaction of making something beautiful. For me. I thought about the warehouse Lloyd had shown me. Hundreds of planks, each one labeled with date and location. The oldest from 1993, but most from 1995 forward. After this entry, after my father had decided to make every cut an act of love, I sat on the workshop floor holding the diary, and something broke open in my chest that I didn't know how to name. Not grief exactly, not joy, something older than both, something that felt like understanding arriving 40 years too late. My father had spent half his life speaking a language of love I was only now learning to read. He had said it in his diary. He had said it in every plank in the warehouse. He had said it in every tree he refused to harvest before its time. He had said it in this workshop in the vault below, in the trust he'd established, while I was too young and stupid to see what was coming. Every cut I make from now on is love I cannot speak aloud. 18 years of cuts, thousands of planks, millions of saw strokes. All love, all waiting, all mine. But the diary was 200 pages, and I was only at page 50. There were still years of preparation to discover. I spent Friday night reading the diary until the oil lamp burned low, then slept without dreams, and woke to Lloyd knocking softly on the bedroom door with coffee. Saturday morning, he led me down wooden stairs I hadn't noticed behind the workshop. Stairs descending into earth where my father had built not a root cellar for food, but a vault for something he valued far more. Lloyd pulled back a heavy canvas tarp near the back wall, revealing a trap door I'd walked past a dozen times without seeing. Square of oak with a recessed iron ring. He lifted it open. Below, a narrow wooden staircase descended into cool, dry darkness. Air drifted up smelling of stone and something faintly sweet. Beeswax maybe, or old wood oil. Lloyd lit an oil lamp and started down. I followed. 15 steps into the earth. The staircase was solid. Father had built these stairs to last, each tread precisely fitted, no creaking, no give. We emerged into a stone chamber, maybe 15 feet across 10 feet deep, with an arched ceiling that reminded me of old church crypts. The walls were fitted stone, dry stacked with the precision of a master mason. Wooden shelves lined 3 walls, and the air was cool, but not cold dry, but not dusty. A treasure chamber carved into the mountain. Your father called this his insurance vault, Lloyd said quietly, setting the lamp on a central table. 25 years of collecting. The lamplight spread slowly, revealing what sat on those shelves. Antiques, not random flea market finds. Museum pieces. On the left wall, 3 oak apple juice barrels from the 1850s, small and precisely crafted wood, dark with age. Each had a small tag tied with wire, written in my father's hand. I picked up one tag and read, Oak Barrel 1852, Sevier County Cooperage. Acquired 2001. Appraised value $4,200. Next shelf, a cherry cabinet small enough to fit on a desk with hand-cut dovetails so fine I could barely see the joints. The tag read, Cherry Writing Cabinet 1840, documented Blount County provenance. Acquired 1998. Appraised value $8,500. Do not sell. For Harlan. Do not sell. For Harlan. I moved to the next item. an antique blacksmith tool set in original wooden case. Tag, Blacksmith Tools. Tennessee Forge 1865. Acquired 2003. Appraised value $3,800. For Harlan. Every object on these shelves had my name on it. 25 years, Lloyd said behind me. Your father never sold one piece, only bought and preserved. My father had collected antiques the way other men collected stamps, except every piece was worth thousands, and every label ended with the same 3 words for Harlan. In the center of the vault, displayed separately, was the piece that made me stop breathing. A black walnut cabinet, maybe 4 feet tall, 3 feet wide, standing on a low platform under a glass protective cover. Hand-carved with mountain laurel motifs running up the corners, the wood so dark it looked almost black. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every joint invisible, every carved leaf perfect. I lifted the glass cover carefully. The tag hung from a small brass hook on the back. Black walnut cabinet 1847 Appalachian master craftsman unknown. Acquired 1998 private estate. Appraised value $180,000. Never sell. Museum quality. For Harlan, when he understands. $180,000 for a single piece of furniture. Your father searched for that cabinet for 15 years, Lloyd said. When it finally came up at a private estate sale, he drove to Kentucky and bought it the same day. Paid cash, brought it here, and never told anyone. I touched the walnut wood. Cool, smooth, perfect. Every object here had my name on it. Everything was for me. I walked around the vault slowly reading tags. Dozens of pieces. Oak chairs from the 1830s, cherry bowls, walnut tool handles. Each one documented with date, origin, acquisition year, appraised value. My father had spent 25 years quietly searching estate sales auctions, private collections. Building a fortune one antique at a time. Building my inheritance in silence. There's more, Lloyd said. He walked to a small locker built into the stone wall, pulled out a weatherproof file box, set it on the central table. Opened it. Inside, documents in archival folders. Trust papers, property deeds, asset inventory, and, most critical, a beneficiary certificate in a sealed envelope. I opened the envelope with hands that wouldn't stay steady. The certificate was dated July 1994. Notarized. Legal language I mostly understood. Copper Ridge Family Trust. Irrevocable. 800 acres registered property. Harlan Ingram, sole beneficiary. But there were stamps on the document. Update stamps. 1997, 2000, 2003, 2006, 2009, 2011. Your father updated these documents every 3 years, Lloyd said. Estate lawyers advised it. Keeps everything legally unassailable. He never missed once. I looked at the stamps again. 1994, 1997, 2000, 2003, 2006, 2009, 2011. 2011. The last update was 2011, and my father died in 2012, which meant he knew his time was running short and made one final trip to the lawyer to protect me. The last update was 2011, Lloyd said quietly. 1 year before he died, he knew his time and made sure everything was current. Every 3 years for 17 years, he went to the lawyer, paid the fees, signed the papers. The final time, he was already sick. I drove him to Knoxville for the appointment. He could barely walk, but he made sure this trust was perfect. I set the certificate down on the table. My father had updated these trust documents every 3 years for 17 years. 1994, 1997, 2000, 2003, 2006, 2009, and finally 2011. 1 year before he died, he had known his health was failing, he had known his time was short, and he had used that final year to make one last trip to the lawyer, one last notarization, one last update to ensure that when I needed this vault, the law would be on my side. The trust was ironclad, the property was mine, the antiques were mine, the 800 acres of forest was mine. None of it could be touched by divorce, none of it could be seized by guardianship. None of it could be stolen by Colleen, or Thane, or Thornton. My father had built me a fortress. But I still hadn't seen Lloyd's 18-month evidence file, and we had 18 days left until the guardianship hearing. The trust was ironclad. The law was on my side. My father had built a fortress that couldn't be breached. But I still needed to understand what I was fighting. That evening, sitting by the workshop fireplace with black coffee going cold between us, Lloyd opened his laptop and said 5 words that would transform everything I thought I knew about my son's betrayal. It's not their first time. He plugged the USB drive into the laptop, the screen filled with folders organized by date. The oldest was labeled May 2023, 18 months ago. I started watching in May 2023, Lloyd said quietly. Your son asked me questions about the mill at a family gathering. Wanted to know about your father's estate, about property values, about what happened to assets when someone died interstate. The questions felt wrong. 18 months, I said. You knew for 18 months. I suspected, Lloyd corrected. I needed to be certain before I told your father's son that his own child was planning to destroy him. He opened the first folder. Photos. Time-stamped images filled the screen. Thane walking into a law office in Knoxville. Thane shaking hands with Thornton Wolfe on the sidewalk. Thane sitting across a desk from Thornton, documents spread between them. June 2023, August 2023, November 2023, February 2024, April 2024. 5 meetings, 10 months. Before Colleen ever mentioned divorce, before the guardianship petition, before any of this became real. Your son met with Thornton 5 times, Lloyd said. Not pressured, not coerced. He sought him out. I stared at the photos. My son. Shaking hands with the man who would try to erase me from existence. Lloyd opened the next folder. Audio. Clicked a file labeled Thane_Thornton_call_ September 14th _2024.mp3. My son's voice filled the workshop. How do we prove cognitive decline? What documentation does the court need? Thornton's voice smooth and confident. Medical records showing missed appointments, confused behavior, financial mismanagement. Your family doctor can provide testimony. I'll draft the language. And then what? Then the court appoints a guardian. You most likely. You take control of his assets, his decisions, his life. You can sell the mill, settle the debts, do what needs to be done. The audio file timestamp read September 14th, 2024. 6 weeks before Colleen served the guardianship papers, my son was already asking lawyers how to declare me incompetent. Keep listening, Lloyd said. Thane's voice again. What if he fights it? They always fight, Thornton said. That's why we need solid documentation. The court won't care what he claims if the medical evidence is clear, and it will be clear. I'll make sure of it. I closed my eyes. That's my son's voice, planning to erase me. 18 months of planning. Lloyd closed the audio file and opened the financial folder. Transaction receipts, bank statements, wire transfers. One document made me stop breathing. March 15th, 2024. Wire transfer from Thornton Wolfe to Desert Mirage Casino, Las Vegas. Amount $340,000. Reference settlement of debt, Thane Ingram account. Your son owed $340,000, Lloyd said. Gambling debt. Thornton paid it in March. After that, Thane had no choice but to cooperate. $340,000. Thane had never mentioned gambling, never mentioned debt, never asked me for help. He'd asked Thornton instead, and Thornton had bought himself a co-conspirator. There's one more folder, Lloyd said. He opened background. Inside, Kentucky court documents, a case file from 2021, State of Kentucky versus Thornton Wolfe, guardianship fraud investigation. I leaned closer to the screen. The case summary read like a mirror of my own life. 71-year-old widower, Arthur Brennan. Daughter's boyfriend, Thornton Wolfe. Son with gambling debts. Guardianship petition claiming cognitive decline. Attempted seizure of $900,000 property. Kentucky 2021, Lloyd said quietly. Same scheme. Guardianship fraud on a widower. His daughter's boyfriend paid the son's debts, then filed a petition claiming the father was incompetent. Tried to take control of a farm worth almost $1 million. I scrolled down the document. The case had been investigated by the state attorney general. Medical fraud, conspiracy, witness tampering. But the final page showed case dismissed. Insufficient evidence. Key witness withdrew testimony. He got away with it, I said. He got away with it, Lloyd confirmed. The son withdrew his testimony in exchange for a settlement. Without the son's cooperation, the case collapsed. Thornton walked away free. I had thought this was about greed, about a weak son, an ambitious wife. But it was about a predator who'd done this before. who had a system who knew exactly how to exploit families like mine. He refined the approach, Lloyd said. Learned from Kentucky. This time he found a wife instead of a girlfriend. This time he documented everything more carefully. This time he made sure the son was in too deep to back out. I looked at the Kentucky file again. Arthur Brennan, 71 years old, widower, property worth $900,000. Thornton had tried to steal it, and when that failed, he'd found another target. Me. He made one critical mistake this time, Lloyd said. I looked at him. He tried to run his scheme on the son of Emmett Ingram, Lloyd said. A man who spent 30 years preparing for predators exactly like him. A man who recruited me 20 years ago and told me to watch, to wait, to document everything when the threat finally came. Lloyd closed the laptop. Thornton Wolfe walked away from Kentucky because the witness withdrew. He said, "But I've been watching for 18 months. I have photos of every meeting, audio of every call, financial records of every transaction. He can't make his witness withdraw this time." "Because the witness isn't Thane," I said slowly. "Yes, the witness is me," Lloyd said, "and I'm not going anywhere." Thornton Wolfe had done this before. 3 years ago in Kentucky, same scheme, same steps. And he'd walked away free when his victim's son withdrew testimony in exchange for a settlement. He had refined the system, perfected the approach, and when he met Colleen, he'd seen another opportunity. But he had made one critical miscalculation. He had tried to run his scheme on the son of Emmett Ingram, a man who'd spent 30 years preparing for predators exactly like him. And Lloyd had been watching for 18 months, documenting every meeting, every call, every transaction, building a case that wouldn't collapse. Lloyd's USB drive had given us 18 months of surveillance proving Thane and Thornton's conspiracy. The evidence was damning: photos, audio recordings, financial transfers linking my son to a man who'd committed identical guardianship fraud before. But evidence needed authentication, professional verification that would survive cross-examination. I called Chester Bennett Sunday night. He arrived Monday morning with a truck full of equipment I'd never seen before. Chester stepped out at 8 o'clock sharp, pulling a rolling case from his passenger seat. At 71, he moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades measuring things that mattered. "Brought the serious tools," he said, unzipping the case to reveal instruments that looked more like surgical equipment than anything I recognized from our 40 years of friendship. A laser distance measurer, a digital moisture meter with sensors that could read internal humidity without drilling, something he called a spectral analyzer for detecting wood species and age, a tablet already loaded with auction databases and timber pricing software spanning the last 20 years. "This isn't just for the lawyers," Chester explained, powering up the tablet and syncing it with his instruments. "If this goes to trial, we need documentation that'll make their expert witnesses look like amateurs. Every piece cataloged, photographed, cross-referenced with comparable sales. Chain of custody established, by the book." Lloyd unlocked the vault, and Chester went to work with the methodical intensity of a man who understood that precision mattered more than speed. The next 6 hours passed in a rhythm of measurement and documentation. Chester moved through the timber warehouse like a man conducting surgery, examining each plank, with the moisture meter recording dimensions, with the laser photographing grain patterns from multiple angles. The UV light he used on the antiques buzzed with a frequency that made my teeth ache, revealing old repairs and original finishes invisible to the naked eye. The workshop smelled like aged walnut and machine oil, scents so familiar they'd become invisible until Chester's equipment made everything clinical and strange. This wasn't my father's sanctuary anymore. It was evidence being transformed into courtroom ammunition. Black walnut, quarter sawn, air-dried, dated 1998. Chester murmured into his tablet's voice recorder. Dimensions 8 feet by 14 inches by 2 inches. Grain pattern consistent with slow-growth Appalachian stock. No checks, no split storage conditions optimal. Current market value based on comparable sales at heirloom timber and urban hardwoods. He tapped the screen, consulting his database. $470 per board foot. I watched him work, calculating quickly in my head. That single plank was worth over $5,000. And there were hundreds more just like it. My mind kept drifting to the diary entries I'd read, my father's careful records of every piece he'd saved, every treasure he'd acquired. He'd known exactly what he was building. Chester was just translating it into language a court would understand. What would you do if you discovered something worth millions hidden in your family's past? Something built over decades in complete secret? Would you use it to fight back against people who betrayed you, or walk away and let it stay buried? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your answers might surprise you. Chester moved to the vault where the antiques waited in their climate-controlled darkness. He pulled out a jeweler's loupe for the smaller pieces, examining joinery and patina with the focused intensity of a man who'd spent his career distinguishing genuine from fake. The 1847 black walnut cabinet received 20 minutes of scrutiny measurements of every dovetail joint, photographs of the original brass hardware from 6 different angles, notes about the hand-planed interior surfaces that proved its age and provenance. Watching him examine those dovetails triggered a memory I hadn't accessed in 50 years. I was 13, standing at my father's workbench, while he showed me how to cut the angled pins that would lock 2 boards together without nails or glue. "The joint is stronger than the wood itself," he'd explained, guiding my hands with his calloused fingers gentle against my smaller ones. "That's what you're aiming for, connection that doesn't just hold, but makes both pieces better than they were alone." I'd ruined 6 practice boards before I cut one that satisfied him. He'd kept that first successful joint in a drawer for years, showing it to customers as proof that patience produced precision. I'd forgotten that. Forgotten the quiet pride in his face when I'd finally understood what he was teaching. Forgotten that carpentry had ever been something we shared instead of something that separated us. Forgotten that there was a time when I'd wanted nothing more than to be exactly like him. The afternoon sun was slanting low through the pines when Chester finally powered down his equipment. He'd cataloged 217 pieces of timber, 38 antiques, and the property itself, taking elevation photos with a drone I hadn't even noticed him launching. His movements had grown slower as the day progressed, his usual efficiency giving way to something heavier. He closed the vault door with care that felt almost ceremonial, then walked outside and sat down heavily on the workshop steps. The tablet glowed in his lap as he compiled his notes, fingers moving across the screen with the deliberate slowness of someone double-checking figures they didn't quite believe. I could see his reflection in the screen, his weathered face tight with concentration, then slowly shifting into something that looked almost like concern. I followed him out, settling onto the step beside him. The wood was still warm from the afternoon sun. "How bad is it?" Chester didn't answer immediately. He removed his glasses, cleaning them with the handkerchief he'd carried for 40 years. When he replaced them and looked at me, his expression wasn't the friendly concern I'd expected. It was something harder, more serious, almost grave. "We need to talk about this number," he said quietly. Chester set the tablet between us on the workshop steps, the screen glowing with rows of numbers I couldn't quite process. His hands were steady, but his voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. "The timber alone..." He began tapping the first category, walnut and cherry, aged and stored under optimal conditions. Current market rates for museum-grade material put it at $4.5 million. The number hung in the air like something physical. I'd spent 40 years cutting wood pricing lumber by the board foot, but I'd never imagined my father's quiet collection adding up to anything approaching that figure. The antique pieces in the vault. Chester continued scrolling to the next section. I've cross-referenced every item with auction records going back 20 years. Conservative estimates pending formal authentication, total $1.2 million. He paused, his finger hovering over a highlighted entry. "That 1847 cabinet, Harlan, I've seen, maybe 3 like it in 40 years of appraisal work. Original hardware, documented provenance, hand-carved Appalachian walnut. If it's what I think it is, the Smithsonian needs to see this. We're talking $350,000 minimum, possibly higher." I tried to speak, but nothing came out. Chester removed his glasses, cleaned them with deliberate slowness, then replaced them and met my eyes. "There's one more thing," he said quietly. "Your father filed for a federal conservation easement in 2015. Do you know what that is?" I shook my head. "It's a legal agreement that permanently restricts development on land in exchange for tax benefits and environmental protection. He put these 800 acres under federal conservation status 11 years ago, 9 years before he died." Chester's voice carried something close to awe. "The easement itself has asset value because it guarantees the timber program can continue in perpetuity. Based on comparable protected lands in the Smokies, we're looking at another $2.5 million. My father had been planning this a decade before his death. While I was running the sawmill arguing with Colleen about equipment costs, he'd been here building financial architecture that would outlive us both. How do you sit across from a man who's been your friend for 40 years and hear him say, $8 million, like he's reading a grocery list? How do you process numbers that large when you've spent your entire life measuring success in hundreds, maybe thousands? The workshop suddenly felt smaller, the air thinner, like the walls couldn't contain what Chester was telling me. Total liquidation value. Chester said, his finger moving to the bottom line of the spreadsheet. Conservative estimate, $8.2 million. I sat perfectly still. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called. The afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees, painting the workshop steps in golden light. $8.2 million. The number should have felt like victory, like vindication, like the answer to every problem Colleen and Thane had created. Instead, it felt like standing in a cathedral, something too vast to comprehend, built by hands I'd thought I understood. Chester watched me in silence. After a long moment, he said, "You want me to say congratulations, but this isn't that kind of news, is it?" He never told anyone. I finally managed. 60 years, he built all of this, and he never said a word. "Your father knew exactly what he had," Chester replied quietly. "He just never needed anyone else to know." He began packing his equipment with careful precision, giving me space to breathe. The laser measurer went into its foam-lined case, the tablet powered down with a soft chime, the UV light, the moisture meters, the spectral analyzer, all the instruments that had spent 6 hours translating my father's life into numbers disappeared into Chester's rolling case one by one. "I'll have the formal appraisal report ready by Friday," he said, standing and offering me his hand. "Notarized, authenticated courtroom ready, but Harlan," he gripped my hand firmly. "This changes everything? You understand that?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. Chester loaded his truck in silence, then paused with his hand on the driver's door. "He loved you," he said, looking back at the workshop. "Men like Lloyd don't build something like this out of anger or pride. They build it out of love. They don't know how to speak." He drove away, leaving me standing in the clearing as the sun sank lower through the trees. I walked back into the workshop and sat at my father's workbench. The wood was worn smooth from decades of use, darkened by oil and time. The tools hung in their precise arrangements on the pegboard, each one positioned exactly where his hands had placed them. The workshop was so quiet I could hear the timber settling in the storage racks, hundreds of boards aging, slowly gaining value with every passing year. 60 years of work, and my father never told a soul. $8.2 million. The number should have mattered. It should have felt like power, like the weapon I needed to fight back against Colleen and Thane's betrayal. It should have felt like winning. But sitting there in the workshop as the light changed, as shadows stretched across the floor, and the golden afternoon faded into dusk, I understood something that had nothing to do with money. My father had built an empire in absolute silence. He'd planted 800 acres of walnut trees harvested, and stored timber worth millions, collected museum-quality antiques filed for federal conservation. Status, all of it done alone in secret, without ever once asking for recognition or praise. He'd known what he had. He'd measured it, planned it, protected it. And he'd never needed anyone to know. I sat there until the workshop fell into shadow, until I could barely see the tools on the pegboard, until the only light came from the last sliver of sun filtering through the western window. $8.2 million. The number meant nothing. What devastated me, what filled me with an awe that felt almost like grief, was that he'd done this alone, every board, every cabinet, every secret decision, and never once asked anyone to notice. But now I had to decide, would I keep his silence or use what he'd built to fight back? Chester didn't leave after the appraisal. He stayed for coffee, then dinner sandwiches I made from supplies Lloyd kept stocked in the workshop kitchen. We sat at my father's workbench eating in silence while the sun set through the western windows. When Chester finally spoke again, it wasn't about money. "That cabinet," he said, setting down his coffee mug. "The 1847 piece. I need to tell you something." I waited. "Your father got a call in 2003. Chester continued, his voice quiet. "Smithsonian American Art Museum. They were doing an exhibit on Appalachian craftsmanship, cataloging furniture from the pre-industrial era. Someone had seen a photograph of that cabinet at an estate auction your father attended. They wanted it for the permanent collection." My hands went still. 2003. I'd been 42 years old running the sawmill raising teenagers. I'd never heard about any of this. They offered $280,000, Chester said. Cash, authenticated provenance, immediate acquisition. Your father said no. White, Chester met my eyes. He told them, this belongs to my son. When he's ready, he'll decide. The workshop seemed to tilt. My father had turned down nearly $300,000 enough to upgrade every piece of equipment in the sawmill, enough to secure the business for another decade because he wanted to preserve my choice. 21 years before Colleen and Thane's betrayal, he'd been protecting my future agency. You want me to call them? Chester asked gently. See if they're still interested? Not yet, I said, my voice rough. But soon. Chester left just after dark. I slept in the workshop that night, using the same cot Lloyd kept for overnight work sessions. When I woke Tuesday morning, Lloyd was already there setting up a folding table with maps and documents spread across the surface. I'd known him for 8 days now, known him as the man my father had trusted with this entire sanctuary. What I hadn't known until he arrived that morning, in pressed khakis and a button-down shirt, wire-rimmed glasses catching the early light, was that Lloyd Spencer wasn't just a caretaker. He was an attorney who'd been handling rural property law for 30 years. 14 days, Lloyd said without preamble, tapping the calendar. We need to move fast. Chester arrived 20 minutes later, and the three of us stood around that table like generals planning a campaign. 14 days felt like standing at the edge of a forge. The heat was coming, but I had the hammer in my hand this time. The surveillance evidence. Lloyd began pulling out printed photographs and audio transcripts. 18 months of documentation showing Thornton's contact with Thane, the gambling debt payments, the planning conversations. I'm submitting everything to the state attorney general by Friday. Thornton's committed financial fraud before this creates a pattern they can't ignore. And Thane, I asked? The IRS gets a full report on the gambling debts and the suspicious debt forgiveness, Lloyd said. $340,000 in write-offs without proper documentation raises flags. Even if the guardianship proceeds, Thane's going to be buried in federal audits. Chester leaned forward, studying the documents. We need the asset protection paperwork ironclad before any of this becomes public. Once word gets out about the appraisal, Colleen's lawyers will argue you're being manipulated, or that the assets should be frozen pending competency evaluation. I've already called Vance Mathis in Nashville, Lloyd said. He specializes in asset protection and trust law. He'll have the documentation drafted by end-of-week irrevocable trust confirmation, conservation, easement verification, authenticated appraisal integration, everything properly notarized and filed. I watched them work, these two men, who'd known my father, who'd kept his secrets, who were now using those secrets as weapons. The workshop smelled like coffee and old wood morning light, streaming through windows my father had installed 40 years ago. We need witness testimony, Chester said, circling something on his notes. Someone who can speak to Colleen's financial behavior, her access to accounts, her pattern of control. Lawrence Henderson at First Community Bank has seen her account activity for 20 years. He'll testify if you ask. The name landed like a stone. Lawrence Henderson had been my banker since 1995, had approved every business loan, every equipment purchase. Asking him to testify meant turning private family shame into public legal ammunition. It meant crossing a line I couldn't uncross. You spend 30 years thinking you know your father, and then a stranger tells you a story that changes everything. You spend a lifetime believing you understand the shape of your family, the boundaries of loyalty, the difference between private grief and public war. And then one morning, you stand in a workshop, built from secrets surrounded by evidence of conspiracy, and you realize the only question that matters is, will you fight back with everything you have, or will you let them win because fighting feels too much like betrayal? I'll talk to Lawrence, I said. Lloyd nodded, making a note. Do it today. We're on a clock. They worked for another 2 hours building timelines, cross-referencing documents, identifying weaknesses in Colleen and Thornton's case, Chester's formal appraisal report, Lloyd's surveillance evidence, Vance Mathis's legal framework, Lawrence Henderson's potential testimony. Every piece fitting together like joints in a cabinet, separate elements becoming stronger than the sum of their parts. When they finally left, I stood alone in the workshop with the calendar marked in red, 14 days. 2 weeks until the guardianship hearing. 2 weeks until Colleen and Thane walked into a courtroom, expecting to paint me as a confused old man with nothing left to lose. But I wasn't that man anymore. I had $8.2 million in documented assets. I had 18 months of surveillance proving conspiracy. I had attorneys in 2 cities building legal architecture designed to protect everything my father had created. I had allies who'd kept faith for decades. The 14-day countdown wasn't a threat anymore. It was my timeline. And I had more weapons than my enemies knew existed. I looked at the cabinet Chester had mentioned, the 1847 piece worth more than $250,000. The piece my father had refused to sell because he wanted me to choose. The wood was dark with age, the joinery so precise, it seemed to defy physics. My father had known what he had. He'd just been waiting for me to be ready to see it. 14 days. The number sat on the workshop calendar like a deadline for war. But, for the first time since Colleen walked out, I wasn't counting down with fear. I was counting down with a plan. And the first step was a visit to First Community Bank, to sit across from Lawrence Henderson and ask one very specific question. Lawrence Henderson stood when I walked into his office Thursday morning, and before he said a word, his eyes went red. He was 58, silver-haired, the kind of banker who still wore cufflinks and kept a handkerchief in his breast pocket. He'd approved my first business loan in 1995, had watched me build the sawmill from 3 employees to 27. But the man who met me that morning looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. "I knew your father 30 years, Harlan," he said, quietly gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "He was the best man I ever met." He pulled a file from his desk drawer, not a digital record, but an actual physical folder, edges worn from handling. The tab read, "Lloyd Family Trust, established 1994. When Chester called yesterday asking me to verify the trust documents, I read the whole file again. Lawrence said, opening it with hands that trembled slightly, "Your father set this up the month you got married. Sole beneficiary you. Successor trustee after his death, Chester Bennett. Irrevocable terms, meaning no one, not even your father, could change it once it was established." He turned the file toward me. The first page was a legal document I'd never seen, never known existed. My name typed in stark black letters beside the word beneficiary. The cash account. Lawrence continued, his voice thick. $127,000. It started in 1996 with a $5,000 deposit, then another the next year, and the next. 15 years of timber sales through private channels. Buyers your father worked with directly, payments that never touched the sawmill's books. He pulled out a stack of deposit slips bound with a rubber band, set them on the desk between us. The paper had yellowed with age, the ink faded, but still legible. "He never spent a penny on himself," Lawrence said. "Not once. Every dollar went here." I picked up the first slip. The date read, April 1996, the amount $5,000. And in the memo line in my father's careful handwriting, "For my son." I flipped to the next slip, June 1997, $7,000. "For my son." Another, March 1999, $6,000. "For my son." I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, just stared at 15 years of deposit slips, each one marked in my father's careful handwriting with the same 3 words. While I'd been running the sawmill, arguing with Colleen about overhead costs, raising children who would grow up to betray me, my father had been here making deposits in silence, building something I'd never known to look for. "I'm sorry," Lawrence said, pulling off his glasses to wipe his eyes. "I promised him I wouldn't tell you until after he was gone. He said you'd try to refuse it if you knew." The office was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of teller transactions beyond the closed door. Through the window, I could see the parking lot where I'd parked 1,000 times over the years, never knowing that inside this building in this office, my father had been creating architecture designed to outlive him. "Will you testify?" I asked, my voice rough. "At the guardianship hearing, will you tell a judge what you just told me?" Lawrence met my eyes. "I'll tell them everything." 2 days later, I sat in Vance Mathis's Nashville office while he laid out 3 folders on the conference table like a dealer showing his cards. Vance was 49, sharp-eyed, with the kind of precision that came from 30 years of protecting assets from people who wanted to take them. Chester joined us by speakerphone from his office in Knoxville. 3 strikes at once, Vance said, tapping the first folder. The trust documents prove they can't touch the assets. Clean beneficiary designation from 1994, authenticated by the bank, witnessed and notarized. The conservation easement is federal. Even a guardianship court can't override environmental protection law. He opened the second folder. Thornton's guardianship petition, fraud. We've tied it directly to his Kentucky record. He pulled this same scheme in 2021. Got a woman declared incompetent, moved her into a facility, and started liquidating her assets. Only reason he's not in prison is the key witness withdrew testimony. We've got depositions from the Kentucky case. He'll be lucky to avoid jail this time. The third folder was thinner. IRS audit notice for Thane. $340,000 in unreported debt forgiveness constitutes taxable income. They'll contact him Monday morning. He'll know exactly what he's facing before he walks into court. What do you do when your lawyer hands you 3 loaded guns and asks which one you want to fire first? What do you do when the people who tried to destroy you are about to discover you've been building an arsenal they never saw coming? When do they get served? I asked. Vance checked his watch. Tomorrow, Sunday morning. Process servers are already briefed. Colleen at the house, Thane at his apartment, Thornton at his office address. They'll all have the paperwork by noon. And the trial is in 10 days. Chester's voice crackled through the speaker. They'll have 9 days to respond, to prepare, to figure out how to counter what we've built. If they show up at all, Vance said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. I looked at the 3 folders spread across the conference table, trust documents that proved my father had protected me 3 decades ago, fraud charges that could send Thornton to prison tax audits that would bury Thane in federal investigations. We'd built a legal structure designed not just to defend, but to obliterate. You think they'll fold? I asked. Vance leaned back in his chair, considering. Colleen filed for guardianship, thinking you were a confused old man with a failing sawmill and nothing else. Thane went along because Thornton promised to handle everything. Thornton thought he'd found another easy mark, another victim without resources or allies. He tapped the folders. Tomorrow, they find out they were wrong about all of it. The question isn't whether you'll win Harlan. The question is whether they'll have the courage to face what's coming. I sat there in the Nashville office Saturday afternoon, light slanting through the windows, and felt something shift inside me. The counterclaims would be served tomorrow Sunday morning. Colleen, Thane, Thornton. All 3 of them would wake up to envelopes that changed everything. 10 days until trial. But for the first time since this started, I wondered if we'd even make it to court. The war could end before it began. Not with a trial, but with silence. With my enemies realizing they'd walked into a fight they couldn't win and simply choosing not to show up. The question wasn't whether we'd win anymore. It was whether they'd even show up. Vance's call came Monday morning, 8 days before the trial. That probably wouldn't happen. I was in the workshop going through my father's old journals when my phone lit up. Nashville area code. I answered on the second ring. They're collapsing, Vance said without preamble. Faster than I expected. I set down the journal. Tell me. Thornton hired a criminal defense attorney Saturday night, Vance said, and I could hear papers rustling on his end. Michael Brennan out of Memphis, he handles white-collar fraud cases. Thornton's not fighting your case anymore. He's preparing for prosecution. The state AG's already flagged the Kentucky connection, and they're building a pattern case. The workshop was quiet except for the sound of my own breathing. Thane called the IRS himself, Vance continued. Sunday afternoon, 3 hours after being served. Didn't hire a lawyer, didn't consult anyone. Just picked up the phone and told them he wanted to cooperate in the investigation. Threw Thornton completely under the bus to save his own skin. There it was, the moment the conspiracy revealed itself as nothing more than fragile self-interest. Thane hadn't been loyal to Thornton or to the plan. He'd been protecting himself, and the second that protection evaporated, so did his allegiance. And Colleen, I asked. Withdrew the guardianship petition this morning, Vance said. Complete withdrawal. She's not claiming incapacity anymore, not questioning your mental competency. The only thing left on the docket is the divorce and asset division. I should have felt something. Victory, maybe, relief. The satisfaction of watching people who'd tried to destroy me turn on each other instead. But sitting in my father's workshop surrounded by 60 years of patient work, all I felt was tired. What happens now? I asked. The divorce hearing proceeds as scheduled, Vance said. But without the guardianship claim, it's straightforward. The trust documents prove the assets are protected. The conservation easement is federal law. She can't touch any of it. You'll walk away with everything your father built, and she'll get whatever marital assets remain at the sawmill. Everything my father built. The phrase should have sounded like winning. "Harlan." Vance's voice pulled me back. "This is good news. They're done. You won." "Yeah," I said. "Thanks for the update." I hung up before he could say anything else. The workshop settled into silence. Morning light streamed through the windows my father had installed, painting everything gold. Outside, the walnut trees he'd planted stood in perfect rows, decades of growth made visible. Inside, the timber he'd saved sat in careful stacks, each board labeled with his handwriting. The antiques in the vault waited in their climate-controlled darkness, worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. $8.2 million in protected assets, 18 months of surveillance evidence, legal documentation that had shattered a conspiracy in less than 72 hours. I'd won. So why did it feel like I'd lost everything that mattered? What's the point of protecting $8 million if there's no family left to protect it? 4. What's the point of a sanctuary built for your son when your son is the one who tried to take it? What's the point of winning a war when the victory just leaves you alone in a workshop full of ghosts? I walked to the window and looked out at the forest. 800 acres of Appalachian hardwood, protected in perpetuity by federal law. My father had spent 3 decades planting these trees, knowing he'd never see them reach full maturity, knowing I might never appreciate what he'd built, knowing he might die before I understood. He'd built it anyway, not for recognition, not for gratitude, just because he loved me and didn't know how else to show it. The divorce would proceed. Colleen would get the sawmill, the business I'd spent 40 years building, now buried in debt and outdated equipment. She'd probably sell it within a year, take whatever equity remained and disappear. Thane would spend the next decade dealing with IRS audits and federal investigators. Thornton would face criminal prosecution for a pattern of fraud that stretched across state lines. And I'd be here, alone, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of timber and antiques and protected land that meant nothing without someone to share them with. My phone sat on the workbench where I'd left it. I picked it up, scrolled through my contacts, and stopped at a name I hadn't called in 3 weeks. Emmett, my younger son, 28 years old, working as a civil engineer in Chattanooga. The one who hadn't conspired with Thornton, hadn't accumulated gambling debts, hadn't actively tried to steal from me. The one I'd thought might be different. 3 weeks of silence. My son, 28 years old, and he couldn't pick up the phone to ask if his father was okay. I'd called him the day after Colleen left, told him what was happening, asked if he knew anything about the guardianship petition. He'd said no, said he was sorry, said he needed time to process everything. I'd understood. Family fractures are complicated, and Emmett had always been close to his mother. But 3 weeks without a single message, without checking in, without asking how I was holding up, without even acknowledging that his mother and brother were trying to have me declared legally incompetent. Silence is a choice. Emmett wasn't actively betraying me like Thane had, but he wasn't defending me either. He was sitting on the sidelines waiting to see who won before deciding which side to join. Or worse, he'd already decided, and he just didn't have the courage to say it out loud. Maybe he blamed me for the divorce. Maybe Colleen had told him her version first painted me as the problem, the difficult husband, the father, who was never quite good enough. Maybe he believed her. Or maybe he just didn't care. I stared at his name on the screen. 1 tap. That's all it would take to hear his voice, to ask why, to try to bridge this gap that had opened between us like a canyon. 1 tap to find out if my son still considered me his father, or if he'd written me off the moment his mother walked out. My thumb hovered over the call button. The workshop was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. The walnut trees outside swayed in a wind I couldn't feel. My father's journals sat open on the workbench, filled with decades of careful observations about wood and weather and time. Emmett's name glowed on my phone screen. 1 tap. That's all it would take to hear his voice, to ask why, to try to fix this. My thumb hovered over the button, but some bridges you can't cross until you know who's waiting on the other side. I never called Emmett. By Friday morning, when I walked up the courthouse steps, my phone was still silent. The courthouse felt smaller than I remembered, like the war had already shrunk before I walked through the door. Judge Margaret Aldridge presided, mid-60s steel gray hair, the kind of brisk efficiency that comes from 30 years on the bench. She called the hearing to order at 9 o'clock sharp. Colleen sat across the courtroom with her attorney Rachel Kincaid, a composed woman in her 50s. 32 years of marriage, and my wife sat 15 feet away, eyes fixed on the table, never once looking at me. She'd aged in the 3 weeks since she'd walked out. New lines around her eyes, hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for something to end. Vance sat beside me, folders arranged in neat stacks. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor polish. Dissolution of marriage, Ingram versus Ingram, Judge Aldridge began. The guardianship petition has been withdrawn. Esta, correct your honor, Rachel said. My client is proceeding only with divorce and asset division. Mr. Mathis, Vance stood opening his first folder. We'd like to enter documentation regarding the Copper Ridge Family Trust, established July 1994. The trust contains significant assets that predate the marriage by 10 years and are therefore non-marital property under Tennessee law. He slid the documents across. Authenticated trust papers, bank records from 1994, property deeds for 800 acres, the conservation easement, Chester's formal appraisal. Judge Aldridge reviewed them in silence. Rain drummed against the windows. Mrs. Kincaid, does your client contest the trust designation? What? It was to pay the bonds, mais scabidao. Rachel glanced at Colleen, who shook her head once. My client does not contest the trust designation. The legal battle was over before it began. No challenge, no cross-examination, no fight. The conspiracy that had tried to paint me as incompetent had collapsed so completely that Colleen's attorney wouldn't even attempt to dispute the evidence. The trust assets are confirmed as non-marital property, Judge Aldridge said. What remains is division of marital assets. Vance pulled out the second folder. The primary marital asset is the lumber mill property valued at $185,000. Joint bank accounts total approximately $12,000. Mrs. Kincaid, my client requests the lumber mill property. Judge Aldridge looked at me. Mr. Ingram, do you object? I should have felt something. That mill had been my life's work. 40 years of building a business of choices and sacrifices. I'd spent more hours in that building than in my own home. She can have it, Your Honor, I said. I don't object. Rachel Kincaid's shoulders relaxed slightly. She'd expected a fight, but what was the point? The mill was mortgaged, the equipment outdated. Colleen would probably sell it within a year, and I'd still have $8.2 million in assets she couldn't touch. 32 years, gone in 90 minutes. Judge Aldridge finalized the division with mechanical precision. Joint accounts split 50-50. Colleen received the mill. I retained the trust assets. No spousal support. No contested items. The marriage is dissolved, Judge Aldridge said, stamping the documents. Court is adjourned. The clerk brought papers to sign. I wrote my name on the line marked Respondent, the same signature I had used for 40 years. But it looked different now, smaller somehow. Colleen signed on the opposite page. Our signatures had appeared together on mortgage documents, business loans, tax returns, medical forms for our children. Now they appeared one last time, ending everything those other signatures had built. She stood and walked out without looking back. Rachel Kincaid followed, carrying folders that contained the death certificate of our marriage. The door closed with a soft click. I didn't watch her leave, just sat there looking at my hands resting on the courtroom table, weathered, scarred from 40 years of woodwork, knuckles thick and crooked from old injuries that never healed quite right. My hands looked exactly like my father's, same scars, same shape, same story, of building things in silence that no one would see. He'd spent 60 years alone in Copper Ridge planting trees and saving timber and creating an empire no one knew existed. He'd refused a Smithsonian offer to preserve my choice. He'd filed conservation easements to protect land I'd never seen. He'd deposited money every year with notes that said, for my son, because he didn't know how else to say he loved me. And now I'd won everything he'd built, protected it from people who wanted to take it, defended it with evidence and documentation that proved I was competent, capable, worthy. I'd won. And in winning, I'd become exactly what he'd been alone in Copper Ridge, with millions in timber and antiques and protected lands surrounded by wealth and absolutely isolated. My wife was gone. My son Thane had betrayed me. My son Emmett had chosen silence. My father was 12 years dead. Vance packed up his files. It's over, he said quietly. You're free. Free. The word tasted like ashes. I drove back to Copper Ridge through November, rain hands gripping the wheel, the way my father's hands must have gripped it on 10,000 drives to that secret workshop. The road wound through mountains that looked exactly the same as they had yesterday, as they would tomorrow, as they had for millennia. The courthouse disappeared in my rearview mirror, 32 years of marriage reduced to a stamped document in my briefcase. The lumber mill, 40 years of work, signed away in a single sentence. I'd walked in prepared for battle and walked out with everything I'd wanted to protect. But sitting in that courtroom watching Colleen sign her name without meeting my eyes, I'd understood something. My father probably understood decades ago. You can win every legal fight, protect every asset, prove every point, and still lose everything that matters. I didn't watch her leave, just looked at my hands on that courtroom table, weathered, scarred, shaped, exactly like my father's. I'd won everything and become him alone in Copper Ridge with $8 million and no one to share it with. But there was still one thing left, that my father never showed me something hidden in the stone vault that would change what all of this meant. I'd been in that vault 100 times and never once looked up. Friday night after the courthouse, after the rain, after driving back to Copper Ridge in silence, I returned to the workshop. Lloyd had gone home hours ago. The forest was dark except for stars visible through gaps in the canopy. I unlocked the vault and stepped inside, pulling the heavy door closed behind me. The space smelled like old wood and stone and time. I'd cataloged everything down here with Chester the Antiques, worth over $1 million. The 1847 cabinet the Smithsonian had wanted, the centuries of Appalachian craftsmanship my father had collected in silence. But I'd never looked up. I lit the oil lamp hanging near the entrance, adjusting the wick until the flame burned steady and bright. Then, I did something I'd never thought to do before I raised it high above my head. The ceiling appeared in the lamplight like a revelation. It wasn't smooth stone. The entire surface was covered with intricate hand-carved details, not random marks or tool scratches, but deliberate artistry. Lines intersecting at precise angles, curves following natural patterns. Symbols and markers that meant nothing at first glance, but everything when I stepped closer. My heart pounded. The lamp trembled in my hand. I moved to the center of the vault, raising the light higher, and the patterns began to make sense. Not patterns, a map. The entire ceiling was a complete carved map of the Copper Ridge Forest, all 800 acres rendered in stone with astonishing detail. Every ridgeline carved in relief, every stream channel etched in flowing curves, every significant landmark marked with symbols I recognized from my father's timber journals. There near the eastern edge, the granite outcropping where the workshop stood. There running north to south, the creek that fed the valley. There marked with careful cross-hatching, the walnut groves planted in deliberate rows. And at the center carved larger than anything else, rendered with such care, that I could see the individual branches, the double-trunked walnut tree, where Lloyd Spencer used to wait for my father's instructions. Around the perimeter of the map, carved in smaller letters, dates spanning 60 years. 1951, first survey. 1963, North Ridge timber harvest. 1978, creek restoration. 1991, workshop construction. 2003, conservation easement planning. 2011, final planting cycle. This was my father's entire life's work rendered permanent in stone above his most precious creations. Every decision, every harvest, every replanting. The complete blueprint of an empire built in silence over 6 decades. 60 years. He'd spent 60 years carving this map into stone inch by inch, year by year, while I was living my life somewhere else. While I was scorning carpentry, building my own sawmill, raising children, arguing with Colleen about money. He was here alone, documenting everything in stone that would outlast timber, outlast paper, outlast memory. I moved the lamp slowly across the ceiling, following the carved lines. Conservation zones marked with hatched borders. Harvest rotations indicated by Roman numerals. Replanting schedules coded in symbols that matched his journal entries. This wasn't just art, it was instruction. A complete manual for managing the forest in perpetuity, preserved in the one material that wouldn't decay or burn or fade. My father had known he wouldn't live forever, so he'd carved forever into stone. Then I saw the inscription. Below the map in the southeastern corner, carved in careful block letters, large enough to read from the floor. Not my land, your land. I only keep it warm. The words his mother had told him when she deeded him the family property in 1951. The phrase he'd carried for 60 years, and now chiseled into stone as his message to me. He'd never seen himself as the owner, just the caretaker, the one keeping it warm until I was ready. Below that, in smaller letters, a single line, for my son, when he is ready to see. My legs gave out. I sank to my knees on the cold stone floor lamp, still burning in my hand, light flickering across the carved ceiling, that my father had created over decades. Not my land, your land. I only keep it warm. $8.2 million, 800 acres of protected forest, timber worth millions, antiques collected over a lifetime, a workshop built from granite, trust documents filed 30 years before the betrayal. None of it was his. It was always mine. He was just keeping it warm. The entire fortune I'd fought so hard to protect, that I'd defended in court, that I'd used to destroy my enemies, it had never been about defense at all. It had been a gift. The largest, most patient, most carefully planned gift a father could give a son who'd once told him carpentry had no future. You spend your whole life thinking you know someone, and then they show you in silence from beyond the grave that you never understood at all. You spend decades believing your father was distant, uncommunicative, impossible to please. And then you stand in a vault he carved with his own hands and realize he was speaking the whole time. You just weren't listening. I set the lamp down carefully on the stone floor. The flame cast dancing shadows across the ceiling map, making the carved forest seem alive. 60 years of work, 60 years of planning, 60 years of love, expressed in wood and stone, because he didn't know how to say it with words. "Here I am, Father," I said aloud. My voice sounded small in the stone chamber. The vault absorbed the sound, held it, kept it, like it had kept everything else my father had built. The forest map watched from above. The antique stood silent witness. The oil lamp burned steady. Here I am, 12 years too late. 12 years after his funeral, after the burial, after all the words I should have said, while he could still hear them. But I said them anyway, kneeling on the cold floor he'd laid with his own hands, tears falling on stone he'd carved with patience I'd never understood. I wept, for the father I'd misunderstood, for the years we'd lost, for the love he'd shown in silence while I'd been looking for words, for the gift he'd been preparing since before I was born, keeping it warm, waiting for me to be ready to see. I knelt there on the stone floor lamp, flickering tears falling on rock my father had carved with his own hands. Here I am, Father. 12 years too late, but I finally said it, and in the silence that followed, I knew exactly what I had to do with everything he had left behind. The diary had one more entry dated 3 weeks before my father died, and I'd been avoiding it for 12 years. I knew what I had to do with everything he'd left behind, but first I needed to understand why he'd left it the way he did. I built a fire in the workshop fireplace the next morning and sat in his chair with the leather-bound journal open on my lap. The handwriting in those final pages was shakier than the earlier entries, the letters less precise. He'd been sick by then, though he never told me how sick. The entry began simply, "If Harlan is reading this, he's found everything. Good." I could almost hear his voice. "I've spent 60 years building something I never showed him," he wrote. "People will think I was secretive, maybe cruel. But here's what I know about sons they need to learn to stand on their own before they discover there's a safety net. If Harlan had known about this place, about the trust, about what I was saving, he wouldn't have built his own sawmill, wouldn't have learned to solve problems, wouldn't have developed the spine a man needs to survive what life throws at him." The fire crackled. Outside, December wind moved through the pines. I didn't want him to depend on me. The entry continued. I wanted him to stand, then realize I was always here. That's what love is, not cushioning every fall, letting them fall, letting them stand back up, and only then showing them you were ready to catch them if they couldn't. My father had hidden a fortune not out of secrecy, but out of love. He'd wanted me to learn independence before discovering the safety net had always been there. The final note, written in barely legible script, read, "If you can read this far, you've already learned to stand. I'm proud of you, son. I always was." I sat there for a long time, holding the journal, watching the fire burn down to embers. The next morning, I found Lloyd Spencer at the stream that ran through the eastern edge of the property. He was checking water levels, making notes in a field book that looked identical to the ones my father had used. "Can I ask you something?" I said. He looked up, closed the book. "Anything. Why did you stay 37 years taking care of this place? You could have told me after he died. You didn't owe us anything." Lloyd was quiet for a moment, watching the water flow over smooth stones. Then he said, "Your father saved my life in 1987. Never told a soul, not even your mother." The world seemed to stop. "I was investigating illegal logging on the North Ridge," Lloyd continued. "Found 3 men with a truck full of stolen walnut. They pulled guns. I pulled mine, but I'd used the last rounds on a rattlesnake that morning and forgotten to reload. Stupid mistake. They backed me against a cliff edge and I knew I wasn't getting out. He picked up a stone, tossed it into the stream. Your father heard the gunshots while inspecting the tree line. He drove his truck straight at 3 armed men, gun empty, no backup, didn't hesitate. Hit one of them, scattered the others, gave me time to run. They fled in their truck. By the time I got back up and came back, your father was gone. Just tire tracks in the mud. My father saved a man's life and never mentioned it. Not once in 25 years. I found him the next day at the sawmill, Lloyd said. Thanked him. Told him I owed him everything. You know what he said? I shook my head. He said, "Don't tell anyone. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because it was right." Lloyd met my eyes. That's how he lived his entire life. Doing what was right, never asking for recognition, never needing anyone to know. When he asked me to maintain this place, to keep it secret until you were ready, I didn't hesitate. It was the least I could do. We stood there by the stream, 2 men carrying different pieces of the same man's legacy. That afternoon I called Emmett. He answered on the 3rd ring, voice uncertain. "Dad!" Emmett Ingram, 28 years old, my youngest son. The one who disappeared into silence when the family fractured. His voice sounded young, tentative, like he wasn't sure what kind of reception he'd get. "I'm at Grandpa's workshop," I said. "If you want to come one day, I'll be here. No explanation needed, no questions asked, just, if you want to come, the door's open." Silence on the line. I could hear him breathing, hear the hesitation. "What workshop?" he finally asked. "Copper Ridge. Grandpa built something I never knew about. I just found it." Another pause. Then quietly, "Did you know about this, Dad?" All this time, the question carried weight. Did I know about the betrayal? Did I know about the workshop? Did I know anything that I should have told him? "I just found out with you," I said truthfully. "I'm learning about your grandfather the same way you are, from what he left behind." The silence after I spoke to Emmett lasted so long I thought he'd hung up, but he was still there. I could hear him breathing, hear the faint sound of traffic in the background, wherever he was. "Okay," he finally said. I'll think about it. Take your time," I told him. "I'm not going anywhere." He hung up without saying goodbye, but he hadn't said no. Emmett didn't come that day, didn't come that week. But every morning I unlocked the workshop door and left it unlatched. Every evening I checked to see if anything had moved. A chair shifted, a tool touched any sign that someone had been there while I was walking the forest or reading my father's journals. Nothing moved, but I kept the door unlocked anyway. Waiting for a son to forgive you feels exactly like waiting for your father to explain. You don't know if it'll happen, you don't know when, but you keep the door open anyway, because hope is the only thing stronger than silence. 3 weeks passed. The workshop door stayed unlocked. Emmett didn't come. Then Chester called about the Smithsonian. The curator's voice came through the video call, clear and formal, offering $385,000 for a cabinet my father refused to sell 21 years ago. Dr. Sarah Brennan sat in what looked like an office lined with antique furniture, her gray hair pulled back in a professional bun. She was somewhere in her 60s, a specialist in 18th century American furniture, who spoke with the careful precision of someone used to handling priceless objects. "We're prepared to offer $385,000 for the 1847 piece," she said, adjusting her glasses to read from notes. "Substantially more than our 2003 valuation. The market for authenticated Appalachian craftsmanship has increased significantly." Chester sat beside me at the workshop table, watching quietly. The cabinet stood in the vault below us, worth nearly $400,000 to people who measured value in auction prices and museum collections. I thought for 30 seconds, long enough that Dr. Brennan shifted in her chair, probably expecting negotiation. "There's thanks," I said, "but not selling. Father kept it 30 years. I'll keep it longer." Dr. Brennan's eyebrows rose slightly. She glanced at something off-screen, then back at the camera. "Your father said the exact same thing, almost word for word, in 2003 when we made the initial offer." "Good," I said. "Then I'm doing it right." She smiled, a small, respectful expression that acknowledged something beyond money. "If you change your mind, Mr. Ingram will be here." The call ended. Chester nodded once approval in the gesture, and we sat in silence listening to December. Wind moved through the pines. I'd become the same kind of man my father was, the kind who valued legacy over money, who kept things not because they were worth selling, but because they were worth keeping. 4 weeks after the trial, I sat in Vance Mathis's Nashville office with a proposal that would change everything. The timber brings in $85,000 a year, I said. Every penny goes to teaching kids what my father taught me. Traditional woodworking craftsmanship, the kind of skills that die when nobody passes them down. Vance made notes on his tablet. The fund needs a name for the incorporation papers. I'd thought about this for days, walking the forest, reading my father's journals, sitting in the workshop he'd built in silence. He'd spent 60 years creating something in secret. I was going to spend the rest of my life making it loud. Copper Ridge Craft Fund, I said. Established in memory of EC, that's all it needs to say. EC, Vance repeated, typing. Your father's initials. Yeah. Chester agreed to teach alongside me. The workshop my father built to store antiques became a training center. The vault that held millions in preserved craftsmanship would teach kids how to create their own. The forest map carved in stone would guide students learning to read wood the way my father had. My father built his fortune in silence. I was going to spend it making noise, the good kind, the kind that sounds like hammers and saws and young voices asking questions. 6 weeks after the trial, Vance called with the final outcomes. Thornton's going to prison, he said without preamble. Second offense guardianship, fraud the state AG's not letting this one go. They're pushing for significant time. I stood at the workshop window, looking out at the walnut groves my father had planted. And Thane paid $85,000 to the IRS, penalties plus interest for unreported debt forgiveness. He cooperated fully, gave them everything on Thornton's scheme. No criminal charges. $85,000. The exact amount the fund would spend each year teaching kids to build instead of destroy. Colleen's trying to sell the mill, Vance continued. No offers yet. Turns out nobody wants a dying lumber operation in rural Tennessee with outdated equipment and declining contracts. Justice. It came 6 weeks late and felt like nothing at all. I set the phone down and looked out the window for 2 minutes, watching pine branches sway in winter wind. Thornton would go to prison. Thane would pay his debts. Colleen would struggle to sell a business she'd betrayed me to steal. I felt only tired. The storm was finally over. 6 months later, the first scholarship student arrived at the workshop. Tyler Pruitt was 16 years old, a quiet kid from Sevier County, with calloused hands from farm work and eyes that took in everything without speaking. He'd applied through the county school system, submitted an essay about wanting to learn traditional joinery, because his grandfather had been a furniture maker before Alzheimer's took his memory. The Copper Ridge Craft Fund had selected him from 47 applicants. I didn't start with tools, didn't show him the expensive equipment or the antique pieces in the vault. I walked him to the workbench where my father had taught me 45 years ago, picked up a piece of walnut from the carefully labeled stacks, and placed Tyler's hand on it. Close your eyes, I said. Feel the grain. Listen to what it tells you. Tyler's eyes closed. His calloused fingers spread across the wood's surface, tentative at first, then more confident. What am I supposed to hear? He asked after a moment. You'll know when you're ready, I said. My father said the same thing to me. Took me 6 months to understand. The workshop smelled like sawdust and wood oil. June sunlight streamed through the windows my father had installed. Outside, the 800 acres of protected forest stood in silence, growing, waiting, holding 60 years of patient work. My father had built this place in secrecy because he wanted me to learn to stand on my own. He'd carved a forest map in stone because he knew documentation outlasted memory. He'd saved timber and collected antiques and filed conservation easements because he understood that legacy wasn't about what you kept for yourself. It was about what you left behind for others to build on. The workshop he'd constructed in isolation was now filling with the sound of learning. The silence he'd maintained for 6 decades was transforming into voices, questions, the noise of young hands discovering what wood could become under patient guidance. Tyler kept his hand on that walnut for 3 full minutes, eyes closed, breathing steady, listening to something I couldn't hear but remembered feeling. When he opened them, he didn't ask what he was supposed to hear anymore. He just smiled, and I saw my father's face looking back at me through a stranger's eyes. That moment with Tyler seeing my father's face in a stranger's smile reminded me that some things transcend blood, but blood still matters. The knock came in January during the first snow, 3 months after I'd left the door unlocked. I opened it to find Emmett standing on the workshop porch, snow catching in his dark hair, hands shoved in his jacket pockets. 28 years old, and he looked exactly like I had at his age. Same build, same uncertain posture, Same eyes that didn't quite know where to land. "Did Grandpa build this?" he asked. I nodded. "Come in, coffee's hot." We sat by the fireplace without speaking for 10 minutes. I poured coffee. He held the mug in both hands, staring at the flames. Outside, snow fell in thick silence, covering the forest in white. Finally, he looked at my hands resting on the armchair, weathered, scarred, shaped by 40 years of working with wood. "I want to learn to read wood grain," he said quietly. "If you can still teach me." No apology. No explanation for the 3 months of silence, the weeks during the trial, when he'd chosen his mother's side by refusing to choose at all. Just a simple request to learn something I'd spent my life knowing. I stood and walked to the workbench, selected a piece of walnut from the labeled stacks my father had saved decades ago. I placed Emmett's hand on it the same way my father had placed mine when I was 10 years old. "Close your eyes," I said. "Feel the grain." His eyes closed. His fingers spread across the wood's surface, tentative searching. "What do you hear, Dad?" he asked after a long moment. I answered exactly as my father had answered me 53 years ago in this same workshop, teaching the same lesson. "You hear what the wood says. Walnut wood never lies." Emmett opened his eyes and smiled, his first real smile in years, maybe in a lifetime. And I knew we'd be okay, not because we talked about the betrayal or the silence or the months of hurt, but because we were standing together in a workshop built by a man who loved us both, learning a language that required no apology. Healing doesn't always need words. Sometimes it just needs good wood and 2 pairs of hands willing to listen. June came with long days and early light. I woke at 5 one morning and decided to walk the entire property for the first time, all 800 acres, every ridge and valley my father had protected. I started at the workshop and moved east through the walnut groves, touching each large tree as I passed, reading age by bark grain, the way my father had taught me. Some of these trees were 100 years old, planted by my grandfather's generation, tended by my father, now standing under my stewardship. I walked for 4 hours, covering ground that represented 60 years of patient work of planting and harvesting and replanting in cycles designed to outlast any single lifetime. Standing in the center of the largest grove, surrounded by trees that had been growing since before I was born, I realized I was standing in the work of 3 generations. My grandfather had planted, my father had protected. I was teaching others to continue. You think loneliness is being alone? It's not. Loneliness is standing somewhere no one stood before, and no one will stand after. I wasn't lonely anymore, not because someone was beside me in that moment, but because I could feel the presence of everyone who'd stood here before and everyone who would stand here after. The forest held us all, past, present, future, in rings of growth that recorded every season. I touched the bark of a walnut tree my grandfather had planted in 1925, a century of growth under my palm, and I wasn't alone. September arrived with golden light and the smell of turning leaves. My 64th birthday fell on a Friday. I spent the morning teaching Emmett and Tyler how to cut dovetail joints, the afternoon walking the forest with Lloyd Spencer, discussing the fall harvest schedule. Evening found me alone on the workshop porch, my father's diary open on my lap. I'd read every entry except the final page. I'd been saving it, I realized, for exactly this moment. The last page contained only 4 lines written in pen, different from the rest, as if he'd added them separately, maybe near the very end. "Son, if you read this far, you've come home. Not the home I built, the home where you are yourself. That's what I want. Love needs no words. It only needs good wood and hands that listen." I closed the diary and held it on my knees, looking out at the walnut forest, turning golden in September light. 800 acres of trees standing in straight lines. Timber worth millions. A workshop carved from granite and silence. A fun teaching the next generation. A son learning to read grain. A father's love rendered permanent in wood and stone. My father had known I'd find this place only after learning to stand on my own. Known I'd reject him, build my own life, make my own mistakes. Known I'd need to fall before I'd appreciate the safety net, the entire hidden fortune. Every tree, every plank, every cabinet, every dollar had been designed to teach me independence before inheritance. "I'm here, Father," I said aloud to the empty porch, the golden forest, the September wind. "I'm here. 3 generations of men who couldn't say I love you, but could grow a forest that said it for them. 3 generations who built in silence because words felt inadequate to carry the weight of what they meant. 3 generations learning that the best love never needs speaking. It only needs to be left in every grain of wood, every carefully saved plank, every tree planted in perfect rows waiting for a child to finally claim it. I closed the diary and looked at my hands, the same hands that touched that first walnut tree at age 10. The same hands my father had, the same hands my son was learning to use. The wood grain never lies. Neither does love. It just waits in silence until you're ready to hear it. And to you listening to my story, remember this. The people closest to you can sometimes hurt you the deepest, but that doesn't mean love stops existing. Looking back, I made mistakes. I spent 40 years building a sawmill while ignoring what my father was trying to teach me about legacy. I chose business over family conversations, assumed I knew everything, and missed the signs of family betrayal happening right under my roof. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait for loss to teach you what love looks like when it's been there all along. Here's what I learned. Family betrayal doesn't define you, how you respond does. My wife and son tried to erase everything, but they couldn't touch what my father built in silence. Sometimes those who say they love you will destroy you, while the ones who never spoke build you an empire in secret. I believe God walked me through that darkness so I could discover real love, not in words or promises, but in 60 years of patient work carved into stone. Love doesn't always speak. Sometimes it just builds and waits, trusting you'll find it when ready. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you experienced something similar? How did you find your way through? Please consider sharing this with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you'd like more stories about resilience legacy and finding light in dark places, subscribe to this channel. Your support means everything. Thank you for staying until the very end. Just a reminder, some elements of this story have been fictionalized for narrative and reflection. What matters is the message that sometimes the greatest love is the kind that never demands to be seen, only discovered when you're ready to see it.